Imagine living in a world where the lights of civilization are flickering out. The roads are no longer safe, the cities are crumbling, famine stalks every season, and raiders descend without warning. This was life during the fall of Rome. Once the most powerful empire in the world, Rome's collapse didn't happen overnight. It was a slow and brutal unraveling that lasted for generations. Ordinary people, not just emperors and generals, bore the weight of this decline. Their daily lives were filled with hunger, violence, fear, and an endless fight to survive. In this series, we'll step into their shoes, walking through the ruins of empire, to uncover the brutal truth of what it really meant to live through the fall of Rome. This isn't just history, it's the story of human endurance in one of the darkest chapters of our past. Why life was brutal during the fall of Rome. The last centuries of the Roman Empire were an age of slow unraveling, a time when the glory of Rome's marble cities and mighty legions stood in stark contrast to the reality lived by most of its people. The grandeur of the Colosseum, the sprawling aqueducts, and the imperial palaces often dominate our imagination, but the daily life of the common Roman during the empire's decline was far less magnificent. It was a life defined by fear, uncertainty, hunger, disease, and violence. To live during the fall of Rome was to exist in a world where order, once guaranteed by the Pax Romana, was slipping away with each passing decade. Imagine for a moment walking through the streets of Rome itself in the late 4th century. The city, though still vast and crowded, no longer had the same vitality it once did under Augustus or Trajan. Its population had already begun to shrink from the million souls it once boasted, as plague, famine, and political instability drove people away. The air smelled of smoke from cooking fires and waste from overcrowded tenements. The aqueduct still carried water into the city, but many were in disrepair, broken in parts by neglect or vandalism. Rats scurried through alleyways, and refuse piled in corners where municipal services had faltered. Rome was still the symbolic heart of the empire, but its pulse was weakening. For ordinary Romans, survival depended on a fragile web of systems, grain distributions, military protection, and local governance, that were breaking down. One of the greatest hardships was food insecurity. For centuries, the empire had relied on the annona, the grain dole, to feed its urban population. Ships carried wheat and barley from the fertile fields of North Africa and Egypt across the Mediterranean to supply the great cities. But as the empire fractured and hostile tribes cut off trade routes, the steady flow of grain was disrupted. Riots often erupted when food shipments failed to arrive. Mothers would line up for hours at the granaries only to find there was nothing left for their children. Bread, once the most basic staple of Roman life, could become a rare luxury. In rural areas, life was scarcely easier. Peasants bore the crushing weight of taxation, which grew harsher as emperors scrambled to fund their armies and court extravagance. A farmer might toil from dawn to dusk in his fields, only to have imperial officials arrive demanding tribute he could not afford. Those who failed to pay risked losing their land, falling into debt, or even being bound to the soil as coloni, a condition that blurred the line between free peasantry and slavery. Families lived in constant fear of tax collectors, who were often accompanied by soldiers to enforce payment. The resentment this bred among the rural poor deepened the cracks already splitting the empire apart. And then there was the ever-present shadow of war. To be a Roman in the twilight of the empire was to live with the constant threat of invasion. The once mighty Roman legions, disciplined and nearly invincible in earlier centuries, were no longer what they had been. Civil wars drained their strength, generals turned their swords against one another in pursuit of power, and increasing reliance on mercenaries eroded their loyalty to Rome. This left the empire vulnerable to the waves of barbarian tribes pressing against its frontiers. Goths, Vandals, Huns, and Franks, all names that struck terror into the hearts of Roman citizens, moved relentlessly into imperial territory. Each raid meant burned villages, slaughtered men, and enslaved women and children. Survivors fled in droves, swelling the ranks of refugees who clogged city streets, desperate for protection that rarely came. The brutality of these times was not limited to the battlefield. The very fabric of society grew coarse and uncertain. Violence seeped into daily life. Bandits roamed the countryside, preying on travelers and isolated farms. Within the cities, gangs often held more power than magistrates, extorting shopkeepers and terrorizing neighborhoods. Roman law, once a pillar of civilization, was increasingly undermined by corruption. A man's fate in court could depend less on justice than on how much he could bribe a judge. Ordinary citizens found themselves caught between the predations of officials, soldiers, and criminals, with little recourse for fairness or safety. Disease added another layer of suffering. Epidemics swept through the weakened empire with devastating effects, The Antonine Plague and later the Plague of Cyprian had already shown how fragile life could be in an age with little understanding of medicine. By the time of the empire's decline, outbreaks of smallpox, measles, and other deadly illnesses could decimate entire communities. Crowded tenements in the cities became breeding grounds for contagion. Rural villages too were not spared as soldiers, traders, and refugees carried diseases with them across provinces. For the poor, medical care was virtually non-existent. Families watched helplessly as children wasted away with fever, and priests prayed for mercy that seldom arrived. Religion, too, became a double-edged sword. Christianity had spread rapidly through the empire by the 4th century, offering hope and community to many. Yet the shift from pagan traditions to Christian dominance was not without turmoil. Temples once devoted to Jupiter or Venus were abandoned or destroyed, their priests displaced. Old rituals were outlawed, and tensions often flared between pagans and Christians, or even between rival Christian sections. Faith provided solace, but it also deepened divisions. In some towns, neighbors who had worshipped together for generations now eyed one another with suspicion, fearful of denunciation or persecution. The empire that had once prided itself on tolerance and syncretism grew increasingly intolerant as rulers used religion as a tool of political control. For the Roman elite, life retained a veneer of luxury, but even their world was shadowed by the empire's decline. Wealthy senators and aristocrats still dined in opulent villas, reclining on couches as servants brought platters of roasted meats and amphorae of wine. They enjoyed heated baths, marble mosaics, and libraries filled with scrolls. Yet even these privileges were precarious. Estates were often targets for raiding tribes or desperate peasants. Aristocrats were expected to bankroll imperial demands, donating wealth to support armies or infrastructure projects. Failure to comply could result in exile or confiscation. Thus, even those at the top lived with anxiety, watching the world they knew erode around them. Children growing up during the fall of Rome were raised in uncertainty. A boy might be conscripted into the army before he was fully grown, sent to defend a frontier he barely understood. A girl might be married off at 12 to cement a family alliance, her fate bound to a man much older. Many children did not survive infancy at all, victims of malnutrition, disease, or violence. For those who did, education was increasingly reserved for the wealthy. The famed Roman schools of rhetoric and philosophy declined, replaced by a simpler, more utilitarian education rooted in Christian doctrine. The intellectual vibrancy of the empire dimmed, and with it, opportunities for young minds to flourish. To live in the fall of Rome was, above all, to live in fear of what tomorrow might bring. The future was no longer secure as it had seemed during the High Empire. Rumors of barbarian armies or imperial assassinations traveled quickly, spreading dread through markets and forums. People whispered of omens, comets, eclipses, earthquakes, as signs that the gods had abandoned Rome. Each generation grew up with the knowledge that the world was not stable but crumbling. For many, the empire's decline was not an abstract concept but a daily reality etched in hunger, loss, and fear. Yet, despite the brutality of the times, there was resilience. Families clung to one another, neighbors shared what little food they had, and communities rebuilt after raids. Some found strength in faith, believing that suffering in this world promised salvation in the next. Others adapted, learning to navigate the shifting alliances and dangers of a fractured empire. Rome did not fall in a single night, and its people did not surrender easily to despair. Their lives were harsh, but their endurance remains a testament to the human spirit in the face of collapse. The story of Rome's fall is not just about emperors and battles, but about the millions of ordinary people who struggled to survive as their world unraveled. Their lives, marked by hardship, brutality, and fleeting moments of hope, are what truly reveal why life was so brutal during the decline of the greatest empire the world had yet known. When historians speak of the fall of Rome, they often mean the official date of 476 CE, when the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. Yet the truth is far more complex. The fall was not a single moment but a drawn-out process of decay that stretched over generations. And for those living through it, this slow unraveling meant decades of turmoil, uncertainty, and suffering. One of the starkest aspects of this decline was the growing inability of the state to protect its citizens. For centuries, Rome's greatest strength had been its military machine. The legions were the envy of the known world, highly disciplined, well-trained, and fiercely loyal. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, the character of the army had changed dramatically. Civil wars drained resources and loyalty, with generals often more concerned with seizing the imperial throne than defending the provinces. Whole legions were lost not to foreign enemies, but to infighting among Romans themselves. As this happened, emperors increasingly relied on foederati, alliances with barbarian groups who were granted land within the empire in exchange for military service. These were Goths, Franks, Vandals, and other Germanic tribes who fought under Roman banners but never entirely abandoned their own loyalties. Their presence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they provided desperately needed manpower. On the other, they brought cultural tensions, divided loyalties, and the constant risk of betrayal. To a farmer or merchant living near a garrison of these foederati, there was little distinction between allied tribesmen and enemies. Both could extort supplies, both could plunder, and both might turn on the civilian population when it suited them. The barbarian invasions themselves became an ever-present nightmare. The Gothic sack of Rome in 410 CE shocked the world. For 8 centuries, Rome had stood untouched by foreign armies. Its citizens had grown accustomed to thinking of their city as eternal, unassailable. But when Alaric and his Visigoths marched into the city, looting, burning, and slaughtering, that illusion was shattered. Those who lived through it described scenes of horror: families torn apart, women violated, sacred temples stripped of treasures. Some citizens fled with only the clothes on their backs, wandering into the countryside in search of safety. Others hid in cellars or churches, praying desperately for deliverance. The sack lasted only 3 days, but the psychological wound it inflicted was permanent. And this was not an isolated event. Just a few decades later, in 455 CE, the Vandals stormed Rome again. They were notorious for their ferocity, and though some modern scholars argue their plunder was less violent than legend suggests, the trauma for Romans was immense. By then, the empire's capital had shifted to Ravenna, but Rome itself remained a symbol of imperial majesty. Each sack was more than a loss of wealth, it was a visible sign that Rome's glory was gone. For ordinary citizens, it meant death, slavery, or poverty. Children were torn from parents, marched across seas to be sold in North African markets. Survivors returned to ruins, rebuilding homes only to face the threat of another invasion. Outside the city, life was perhaps even harsher. In the provinces, villages were often the first targets of raiding armies. Entire communities could be wiped out in a single night, with homes torched and inhabitants either killed or carried off. Those lucky enough to escape fled to fortified towns, swelling their populations to bursting. Imagine being a farmer in Gaul or Hispania in the late 5th century, working fields that might be stolen or destroyed at any moment, watching the horizon for the smoke of an approaching warband. The land that had once fed the empire now became a battlefield, leaving famine in its wake. For many, the only option was flight. The fall of Rome created waves of refugees unlike anything the empire had seen before. Families abandoned farms that had been in their possession for generations, joining streams of displaced people on the roads. They carried little with them: some blankets, a few tools, whatever food they could scavenge. Refugee camps formed around cities, filled with starving, desperate souls. Disease spread quickly in such conditions, and competition for resources often turned violent. The Roman sense of order and civic duty dissolved into chaos, as survival became the only goal. Even within the walls of the cities, safety was far from guaranteed. Urban life in the late empire was plagued by overcrowding, unemployment, and crime. The once magnificent forums and markets were falling into disrepair. Marble columns toppled, mosaics cracked, and weeds sprouted in once bustling courtyards. Public buildings were abandoned or repurposed for housing. Temples to the old gods were stripped of their valuables, either converted into Christian churches or left to rot. Citizens walking through the streets passed shuttered shops, gangs of beggars, and armed thugs extorting merchants. In such an environment, even a short walk to the marketplace carried risks. The decline of trade further deepened the misery. The Mediterranean had once been a Roman lake, dominated by imperial fleets that ensured the safe movement of goods. But as Rome's power waned, piracy flourished. Merchants could no longer trust that their ships would reach their destinations, and overland routes were equally dangerous due to banditry. This meant shortages in essential goods: salt, wine, olive oil, and grain. Prices skyrocketed, making life difficult even for the moderately wealthy. For the poor, hunger became a constant companion. Malnutrition weakened bodies already stressed by labor and fear, making people more susceptible to disease. Another brutal reality of this time was slavery. Though Rome had always relied on slave labor, during the empire's decline the institution became even harsher. As the supply of foreign captives dwindled, the empire increasingly turned inward, enslaving its own subjects. Debtors, criminals, and prisoners of war were forced into bondage. Slave markets thrived, fueled by the endless wars and raids. A captured farmer might find himself chained in the fields of Sicily, or a young girl torn from her family might be sold into domestic service in a senator's household. Slavery in Rome was not just physical bondage, it was the destruction of identity, the ripping apart of communities. Families lived in constant fear of raids, knowing that one wrong turn could mean a lifetime of servitude. Religious upheaval added yet another layer of strain. The Christian Church, by now firmly established, wielded growing power. Bishops often held more authority than local magistrates, especially as imperial officials became corrupt or absent. For many, this offered stability, but it also created conflict. Pagan practices, once central to Roman identity, were now branded as heretical. Temples were closed, sacred groves destroyed, and ancient festivals outlawed. Families that had for generations honored Jupiter or Mars now found themselves pressured to abandon their traditions. In rural areas where old beliefs lingered, this often led to violent clashes. Neighbors accused one another of impiety, communities split along religious lines. Faith, which might have been a source of comfort, became yet another cause of division. The psychological toll of these years cannot be overstated. To live in the fall of Rome was to live with constant dread. Rumors of barbarian armies spread like wildfire. A comet streaking across the sky could spark panic, seen as a sign of divine wrath. Earthquakes and famines were interpreted as omens that the world itself was ending. Parents told their children not of Rome's glory but of its dangers. Generations grew up knowing little of peace, seeing only instability and decline. The sense of security that had once defined Roman citizenship was gone, replaced by a grim acceptance that the future held only more hardship. Yet amid this brutality, human resilience persisted. Some found ways to adapt. Farmers built fortified villas, essentially private castles, to protect their families and tenants. City dwellers formed local militias, defending neighborhoods when imperial troops failed. Merchants turned to barter when coinage lost its value, creating new systems of exchange. Even in the darkest times, life went on. Children still played in the streets, lovers still courted one another, and festivals, though stripped of their old grandeur, still brought brief moments of joy. But these were fragile sparks of humanity against the overwhelming gloom. By the time the Western Empire officially fell in 476, many Romans had already accepted that their world was gone. The brutality of daily life had long since taught them that Rome was no longer the mighty protector it had once been. To live during this era was not merely to witness the collapse of a political system, but to endure the slow death of a way of life that had promised security, prosperity, and greatness. For the millions caught in its shadow, the fall of Rome was not a single event but a lived reality, harsh, relentless, and brutally human. By the middle of the 5th century, the Roman world had become a patchwork of fading power and encroaching chaos. What once had been a realm of gleaming cities, straight roads, and imperial grandeur was now a place of half-abandoned towns, crumbling infrastructure, and frightened communities huddling behind walls. For ordinary people, daily life in these decades was defined not by the great decrees of emperors but by the ceaseless grind of hunger, danger, and uncertainty. The very land itself seemed to reflect the empire's decline. Fields that had once yielded abundant harvests now lay neglected. War, overtaxation, and depopulation meant that many farms were abandoned, their owners dead, enslaved, or fled. In Gaul and Hispania, raiding tribes burned granaries and trampled vineyards, leaving scars that took years to heal. In Italy, peasants who could no longer bear the burden of imperial taxes retreated into forests or joined roaming bands of brigands. Agriculture, the lifeblood of Rome, shrank, and with it, the empire's ability to sustain its people. The countryside grew dangerous in more ways than one. Roads that had once been safe under the watchful eye of Roman patrols were now treacherous. Merchants traveling from town to town risked ambush by bandits, deserters, or desperate peasants turned outlaw. The famed Roman road system, so vital to the empire's cohesion, became less a symbol of order and more a conduit for violence. Refugees clogged the highways, entire families trudging along with ox carts, clutching what few belongings they had managed to save. For them, every bend in the road brought the fear of discovery, by tax collectors demanding tribute, by soldiers conscripting sons into a failing army, or by raiders who saw refugees as easy prey. In the towns and cities, the situation was scarcely better. The municipal governments that had once organized markets, public works, and festivals were bankrupt. Wealthy elites, who had traditionally funded public amenities like baths, games, and theaters, increasingly withdrew to their fortified estates, leaving urban populations to fend for themselves. The famous Roman baths, once bustling centers of hygiene, leisure, and social life, fell into ruin. Without maintenance, aqueducts collapsed, fountains dried up, and sewage clogged the streets. Disease flourished in these conditions, adding to the misery. Typhus, dysentery, and plague spread quickly among the malnourished and the weak, killing thousands in outbreaks that became almost routine. For those still clinging to survival, brutality was not just an occasional tragedy, it was a daily reality. Soldiers, whether Roman, mercenary, or barbarian, often lived off the land, seizing food, shelter, and women wherever they went. For peasant families, a knock on the door at night might mean the arrival of men demanding supplies they could not spare. Refusal often led to violence, the burning of the farmhouse, or worse. Stories circulated of villages wiped out entirely because they resisted imperial tax collectors or barbarian raiders. This culture of fear hollowed out communities, leaving people wary of strangers and reluctant to trust even their neighbors. Religion, which might have been expected to provide comfort, often intensified the hardships. Christianity was firmly entrenched by the 5th century, but its growing dominance did not mean harmony. Bishops wielded great authority, rivaling that of secular officials, and used their influence to enforce orthodoxy. Heresies such as Arianism divided communities, especially as many barbarian tribes who had settled in the empire were Arians, while the Roman population increasingly embraced Nicene Christianity. These differences were not merely theological quibbles, they shaped politics, alliances, and daily life. A Nicene farmer might view his Arian Gothic overlord with suspicion, while the Gothic master distrusted the loyalty of his tenants. Violence sometimes erupted in the name of faith, with mobs burning rival churches or dragging opponents before bishops' courts. Meanwhile, the fading remnants of pagan traditions still lingered in rural areas, creating further division. Old rituals, harvest festivals, sacrifices to the household gods, offerings at sacred springs, were condemned as superstition or outright demonic by zealous Christian leaders. Families who clung to ancestral practices risked denunciation or persecution. Some quietly continued their traditions in secret, whispering prayers to Jupiter or Ceres while outwardly professing Christianity. The clash of old and new faiths was not always bloody, but it deepened the sense of dislocation. For many, even the spiritual foundations of life felt unstable, as if the very gods themselves had abandoned Rome. For the empire's elites, the brutality of this age took a different form. They lived in relative comfort behind the walls of fortified villas, but their wealth made them constant targets. Gothic warlords might extort them for protection money, while imperial officials might demand donations for military campaigns. Aristocrats were often caught between loyalty to Rome and the pragmatic need to negotiate with barbarian powers. Many chose the latter, marrying daughters into Gothic or Vandal families, hoping to preserve their estates. This erosion of loyalty from the upper classes further weakened the empire, but from their perspective, survival of their households was more important than the survival of the empire. Even the imperial court itself was marked by brutality. Intrigue, betrayal, and assassination plagued the leadership. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, often elevated by military coups and murdered when fortunes turned. For the ordinary citizen, these power struggles offered little hope. Only the certainty that taxes would rise to pay for yet another failed campaign, and that protection against raiders would be promised but rarely delivered. The throne itself seemed cursed, a revolving door of weak rulers unable to restore order. The role of women during this time also reflected the harshness of life. Elite women could wield influence through marriage alliances, but for the vast majority, existence was defined by vulnerability. Invasion and raiding often meant sexual violence, enslavement, or forced relocation. Mothers struggled to feed their children, sometimes choosing which to save when food was scarce. Widows were particularly vulnerable, as property laws often left them dependent on male relatives or predatory officials. And yet, in the chaos, some women found new roles as managers of households, protectors of communities, or even leaders within Christian congregations. The brutality of the times created suffering, but also unexpected forms of resilience. Children suffered most of all. Many were orphaned by war or disease, forced into slavery, or left to starve. Those who survived often faced brutal upbringings. Boys were conscripted into armies before they reached manhood, trained not in discipline as earlier legionaries had been, but in the desperate violence of survival. Girls were frequently married off young, sometimes as part of deals with occupying powers, other times simply to secure their future in an unstable world. Education, once a hallmark of Roman culture, declined sharply. Where once children might have studied rhetoric, philosophy, and literature, now many were taught little more than basic Christian doctrine. The intellectual life of the empire dimmed, replaced by rote learning and fear of heresy. Economically, the empire's decline turned daily survival into a struggle. Coinage was debased, losing its value as emperors minted more and more silverless coins to pay debts. People increasingly turned to barter, trading livestock, tools, or grain instead of money. Markets shrank and many craftspeople abandoned their trades. A blacksmith might turn to farming because customers could no longer afford his wares. A potter might see her workshop abandoned because nobody had surplus to spend on new vessels. The once complex economy of the empire collapsed into local self-sufficiency, each community trying to provide for itself in isolation. One of the most telling signs of brutality was the sheer hopelessness many felt. Rome had always prided itself on its promise of order and eternity, the idea that to be Roman was to belong to something greater, something unshakable. But in the 5th century that illusion crumbled. People began to think less in terms of Rome, and more in terms of immediate survival. Their village, their family, their next meal. The collective identity that had bound the empire together was dissolving, leaving a vacuum that barbarian leaders, bishops, and local warlords rushed to fill. And yet, amid all this darkness, life continued. Weddings were still celebrated, though often with fewer guests and humbler feasts. Harvest festivals might still take place, now with prayers offered to Christ instead of Jupiter. Songs were sung, stories told, and children played among the ruins of once grand buildings. Humans adapt, even to brutality, and the people of the late empire found ways to endure. Some even thrived, aligning themselves with new powers, finding opportunity in the cracks of a broken system. But for most, survival came at the cost of fear, hardship, and relentless uncertainty. To live during the fall of Rome was to inhabit a world where safety was fleeting, justice was unreliable, and hunger was constant. The brutality was not only in the invasions and sacks that dominate history books, but in the daily erosion of stability, the crumbling of farms, the collapse of cities, the betrayals of leaders, and the despair of families watching their world unravel. The Western Roman Empire was nearing its end, but for the millions who lived through its decline, the story was not one of dramatic battles alone. It was the slow grind of hardship, the brutal reality of existing in a world where the foundations of civilization itself were collapsing. And though Rome would fade, the memory of these struggles, the scars left on its people, would shape the medieval world that followed. By the late 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had all but ceased to exist as a functioning state. What remained were scattered fragments of Roman authority clinging to survival, propped up by alliances with tribes once considered enemies. But for ordinary people, the collapse was not measured in treaties or imperial decrees. It was measured in empty granaries, burned villages, and the daily struggle to endure in a world where order had given way to chaos. The brutality of this period is perhaps best understood through the collapse of infrastructure. Rome's engineering had once been its pride. Aqueducts carried fresh water across miles of countryside, roads connected distant provinces, and amphitheaters showcased the empire's wealth and leisure. But maintaining such marvels required stability, taxes, and skilled labor, all of which were vanishing. Aqueducts fell into disrepair, their arches crumbling, their channels clogged. Cities that had once enjoyed flowing fountains and public baths now relied on wells or polluted rivers. Without regular sanitation, disease became rampant. The simple act of drawing water could mean exposure to sickness, and the lack of clean supplies worsened the already dire conditions in crowded urban centers. Roads too decayed. Paved highways that had once allowed legions to march swiftly and merchants to trade across vast distances were neglected. Stones shifted, weeds grew, and bridges collapsed. This not only hampered commerce but also isolated communities. A town that had once been a short day's journey from a provincial capital might now feel like a remote outpost, cut off by bandit-infested wilderness. For travelers, every mile carried danger, not just from robbers but from hunger, exposure, and the risk of wandering into hostile territory. The economy reflected this disintegration. Long-distance trade, which had once brought Egyptian grain, Syrian silk, and African olive oil to Roman tables, dwindled to a trickle. Markets grew smaller, more local, and more precarious. Gold and silver coins became scarce, replaced by barter. A farmer might pay a blacksmith with sacks of grain, or trade goats for pottery. Wealthy landowners hoarded what precious metals remained, refusing to release them into circulation. This hoarding intensified the sense of poverty for ordinary people, who increasingly measured wealth not in coins but in livestock, tools, or even the security of a sturdy wall. The brutality of the tax system persisted until the end. Emperors and local officials, desperate to extract resources, burdened peasants with impossible demands. Soldiers often accompanied tax collectors, ensuring compliance through intimidation. A farmer might be forced to surrender not only part of his harvest but also seed grain needed for the next planting season. Failure to comply could mean confiscation of land, imprisonment, or forced labor. Some fled into the wilderness rather than face the imperial tax machine, becoming outlaws or joining barbarian groups. In this way, Rome's own attempts at survival pushed its subjects further away, undermining the very stability it sought to maintain. The brutality of the fall was not limited to hunger or poverty, it was also deeply violent. Invasions continued to ravage the western provinces. The Huns under Attila had terrorized Europe earlier in the century, leaving scars across Gaul and Italy. Even after Attila's death, the vacuum of power drew new waves of conflict. The Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Vandals, and Franks carved territories from the empire's carcass. For civilians, each change of ruler brought fresh uncertainty. Would the new overlords be merciful or cruel? Would they respect Roman traditions or sweep them aside? A family might swear loyalty to Rome one year, only to find themselves subjects of a Gothic king the next. The sack of Rome in 476 may not have been as violent as earlier invasions, but it carried immense symbolic weight. Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor, was deposed by the barbarian general Odoacer, and with him went the illusion of continuity. For ordinary Romans, the empire that had defined their identity was gone. What remained was the raw reality of survival under a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. Some adapted, swearing loyalty to new rulers who promised protection. Others resisted, clinging to the memory of Rome's grandeur even as their lives grew harsher. Religion continued to shape this brutal landscape. Christianity offered solace and community, but it also became a tool of power and control. Bishops mediated disputes, organized charity, and sometimes even commanded militias. Churches became sanctuaries not just of faith but of physical safety, where refugees crowded during raids. Yet the church also demanded conformity. Heretics were persecuted, pagans ostracized, and syncretic practices condemned. The hope of salvation came at the cost of obedience, and those who resisted risked not only spiritual damnation but also worldly punishment. The intellectual world that had once flourished under Rome withered. Libraries were neglected or destroyed, manuscripts lost, and schools closed. Teachers struggled to survive in a world where few valued rhetoric or philosophy. Education narrowed to scripture and basic literacy, often confined to monasteries. For ordinary families, this meant their children grew up with little opportunity for learning beyond religious instruction. The dream of Roman culture, a society where even modest citizens could aspire to education, was dying. In its place, survival skills and faith became the only knowledge most people could hope to pass on. Amid all this suffering, the human cost was staggering. Famine stalked the land as disrupted trade and constant warfare destroyed harvests. Starving peasants ate bark, grass, or whatever they could scavenge. Skeletons from this period show signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, brittle bones, and evidence of disease. Life expectancy plummeted, with many never reaching adulthood. Women often died in childbirth, and infants were frequently abandoned if families could not feed them. Abandonment was not always an act of cruelty but of desperation, as parents prayed their unwanted child might be taken in by someone better able to care for it, or at least spared a slow death from hunger. Slavery remained a brutal fact of life. Captives from wars, raids, or even Roman citizens unable to pay debts filled the slave markets. The fall of Rome did not lessen this burden but increased it, as instability created more opportunities for enslavement. A peasant whose village was destroyed might find himself chained on an auction block in North Africa. A child taken during a raid might spend the rest of her life in servitude. Slavery was not just an institution but a constant threat hovering over the poor, a reminder that in times of chaos, freedom could vanish overnight. Violence was not confined to outsiders. Civil conflict between rival Roman factions, between Christian sects, and even between local communities created a culture of constant bloodshed. Lynching, mob justice, and feuds were common. Without reliable law enforcement, people took matters into their own hands. A theft might spark a riot, a rumor might lead to the burning of a neighbor's house, and suspicion of heresy might result in a public execution. Fear and suspicion poisoned relationships, eroding the trust that communities needed to survive. And yet life went on. Amid the ruins of cities, markets still opened. Farmers still plowed fields even under threat of raiders. Families still gathered around fires, telling stories of Rome's past glories. People married, raised children, and celebrated what festivals they could. The brutality of the fall of Rome did not erase humanity, it forced it into harsher, grimmer shapes. The resilience of ordinary people, though often invisible in grand histories, was the thread that carried civilization forward. In the end, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single catastrophe but a long season of brutality that reshaped every aspect of life. Hunger, disease, violence, and fear were constants. The empire's grand achievements, its roads, cities, laws, and culture, crumbled, leaving behind a scarred landscape of survival. For those who lived through it, the fall of Rome was not a historical event but a daily struggle, a reminder that even the mightiest civilizations can dissolve into brutality when their foundations collapse. The collapse of Rome was not simply the destruction of an empire but the unraveling of a way of life. To the generations who lived through it, the brutality of these years was measured less in grand political changes than in the hardships of daily existence. How to find food, how to keep a family safe, how to endure a world where the very structures of civilization seemed to dissolve. By the late 5th century, to be Roman meant something far different than it had just a century before. One of the most pressing struggles of this period was hunger. Rome's vast network of trade and grain supply, once its greatest strength, had broken down. North Africa, long the breadbasket of the empire, was seized by the Vandals in the early 5th century. The loss was catastrophic. Grain shipments that had sustained Rome's enormous urban population dwindled to nothing. In Rome itself, bread, once distributed freely under the Annona, became scarce. Crowds that had once gathered in the Circus Maximus to watch chariot races now lined up in desperation outside bakeries, often only to discover there was nothing left. Riots broke out when prices soared. For the poor, hunger was constant, gnawing at their bodies and spirits. In the countryside where food was grown, things were no better. Farms were pillaged by roving armies, taxes stripped peasants of their harvests, and constant insecurity made it difficult to plan for the future. A farmer planting seed did so with the knowledge that raiders might burn the fields before harvest or that tax collectors might take everything once it was reaped. Some abandoned agriculture altogether, retreating into forests or mountains, living as fugitives. Others became coloni, legally bound to the estates of wealthy landowners in exchange for protection. This was serfdom in its earliest form, a life where freedom was surrendered in return for the slim chance of survival. Housing reflected the same decline. In cities, the towering insulae, apartment blocks that had once housed thousands, fell into disrepair. Wooden balconies collapsed, roofs leaked, and fires spread unchecked. Families crowded into single rooms, often sharing with relatives or strangers. Privacy was non-existent and sanitation poor. In the countryside, simple stone or wooden huts became the norm, often clustered around fortified villas or monasteries. The grandeur of marble villas and mosaics still existed for the elite, but for most people, home was a fragile shelter vulnerable to both nature and man. The brutality of Roman decline was not limited to physical survival, it was also a psychological ordeal. The Roman identity had long promised security. To be Roman meant belonging to a powerful state that ensured peace through strength. But by the 5th century that promise was hollow. Barbarian invasions shattered the sense of safety. Rumors of approaching armies spread terror through villages. Families fled with little warning, carrying what they could on their backs. Stories of massacres, whether exaggerated or true, haunted communities, filling dreams with visions of fire and slaughter. Even when raiders spared lives, the destruction of crops and homes left survivors destitute. Children bore much of the suffering. Many were orphaned, sold into slavery, or abandoned by families unable to feed them. Education, once a cornerstone of Roman life, collapsed. Teachers went unpaid, schools closed, and literacy declined outside clerical circles. A generation grew up without knowledge of classical literature, mathematics, or law. Instead, their education was survival, learning to till soil, herd animals, or hide from danger. Childhood itself was shortened. By their early teens, many were already working like adults or married off. For countless young Romans, the empire's fall meant the loss of not only security but of opportunity. The brutality of war left deep marks on communities. The sack of Rome by the Goths in 410 and by the Vandals in 455 were not isolated incidents but part of a pattern of devastation. In Gaul, the Visigoths carved out kingdoms through conquest. In Britannia, Roman legions had long since withdrawn, leaving the population to face Saxon raids alone. Italy itself became a battlefield, ravaged first by Huns, then Vandals, then Ostrogoths. Each incursion meant plunder, destruction, and death. Villages burned, crops were trampled, and sacred sites were looted. Survivors bore scars, physical, emotional, and cultural, that would shape generations. Disease compounded these hardships. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making outbreaks deadlier. Epidemics swept through crowded refugee camps and cities alike. With aqueducts broken and sanitation failing, waterborne illnesses flourished. Doctors existed but had little to offer. Medicine was still a mixture of superstition and limited knowledge. Families often turned to priests or charms for healing, hoping divine intervention might succeed where physicians failed. Death was a constant companion and cemeteries overflowed. Religion, once a source of stability, often sharpened conflict. Christianity had become the official faith, but it was far from unified. Rival sects, Arians, Donatists, Pelagians, clashed with one another and with the Nicene Church. Bishops sometimes wielded more power than generals, commanding loyalty that rivaled secular authority. Churches became fortresses of both faith and survival, places where refugees gathered during sieges. Yet faith also came with coercion. Pagan practices were outlawed, temples destroyed, and dissenters persecuted. For many, adapting to the new religious order was not a choice but a necessity for survival. The brutality of social inequality grew starker as the empire declined. The wealthy elite retreated to fortified estates, living in relative luxury compared to the masses. They dined on fine foods, enjoyed private baths, and surrounded themselves with armed retainers. Yet even their position was precarious. Warlords demanded tribute, emperors levied crushing taxes, and peasants sometimes rose in rebellion. Aristocrats who resisted could find their estates burned, their families killed or enslaved. Thus, even privilege came with fear. The military, once Rome's great protector, became both a shield and a threat. Soldiers were often unpaid, leading them to pillage the very people they were meant to defend. Mercenaries recruited from barbarian tribes brought their own loyalties and rivalries. To see a column of armed men approaching a village was as likely to mean extortion as protection. Conscription swept up young men, many of whom never returned home. Families dreaded the arrival of recruiters, knowing they might lose sons to endless wars fought not for Rome's glory but for survival against one wave of invaders after another. Women too lived precarious lives. Many bore the brunt of violence during raids. Rape, abduction, and enslavement were grim realities. Widows were vulnerable to exploitation, while daughters were married off early to secure alliances or protection. Yet women also became crucial pillars of endurance. They managed households in the absence of men, passed down traditions, and in some cases wielded influence in the church. Female saints and martyrs became models of strength, inspiring others to endure suffering with faith. Despite all this hardship, people still sought moments of humanity. Festivals, though diminished, continued. Markets bustled when possible, filled with barter instead of coin. Families shared stories of Rome's former glory, keeping alive a cultural memory even as the empire itself crumbled. Songs, prayers, and rituals, whether Christian or remnants of pagan practice, offered comfort. In the darkest times, even small joys mattered. A loaf of bread shared, a child's laughter, a safe night without attack. By the time Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476, many ordinary Romans scarcely noticed the formal end of the empire. For them, the brutality of life had long since made the idea of Rome little more than a memory. Their world was no longer defined by emperors but by local warlords, bishops, and the daily struggle to survive. Rome's fall was not just a political event but a lived reality of hunger, fear, and violence. For the millions who endured it, survival itself was the greatest victory. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century, the lived experience of its people had already been brutalized for generations. The story of the fall of Rome is often told through battles, emperors, and invading tribes, but to those who actually lived through it, the collapse was far more intimate. It was felt in the emptiness of their stomachs, in the decay of their cities, in the betrayal of leaders, and in the constant threat of violence that lurked just beyond the village gate. One of the most jarring aspects of the fall was the breakdown of civic institutions. For centuries, Roman citizens had relied on a complex system of governance that provided a degree of order. Magistrates oversaw courts, local councils organized markets and festivals, and imperial administrators ensured that taxes funded infrastructure and the military. But as the empire weakened, these structures collapsed. Corruption became rampant. Governors and officials, unsure how long they would remain in power, enriched themselves at the expense of the people. Justice was no longer predictable. A wealthy man could bribe his way out of punishment, while a poor man might be flogged or enslaved for even minor infractions. This erosion of civic life created a sense of betrayal. To be Roman had once meant living under a system of laws that, at least in principle, applied to all. Now, survival often depended on personal connections, bribery, or the arbitrary whims of local power brokers. The predictability of Roman justice, a hallmark of its civilization, vanished, leaving fear and resentment in its place. Cities, once the pride of Rome, became places of despair. Rome itself, still grand in appearance, was hollowed out by poverty and neglect. Once glorious forums stood half-empty, their statues toppled or stolen for building materials. Amphitheaters were abandoned or repurposed, sometimes as fortresses or quarries. Public baths, once symbols of Rome's sophistication, were shut down as aqueducts collapsed and fuel for heating became scarce. Without regular maintenance, the very buildings that had symbolized Rome's greatness became reminders of its decay. Inhabitants of cities like Rome, Milan, or Trier lived amid these ruins. Tenement blocks sagged with disrepair, threatening collapse. Fires swept through neighborhoods unchecked, leaving behind charred husks. Crowds of beggars filled the streets, while gangs enforced their own law in the absence of functioning city guards. For a citizen walking through these streets, danger was everywhere, whether from falling masonry, sudden robbery, or the eruption of a mob angered by hunger. The brutality of Rome's decline was amplified by the constant threat of invasion. For centuries, the empire's borders had been defended by legions. But by the 5th century, those legions were underpaid, understrengthed, and often staffed by men with little loyalty to Rome itself. Entire provinces were left exposed. When news spread of approaching raiders, Visigoths in Gaul, Vandals in Africa, Huns in Italy, panic followed. Families fled with whatever they could carry. Those too poor or too old to move often met horrific fates. The sack of Rome in 410 by Alaric and his Visigoths had sent shockwaves through the empire, but for people in the provinces such devastations were not rare shocks, they were recurring nightmares. In Gaul, invasions left cities like Mainz and Trier in ruins. In Britannia, Saxon raids devastated coastal towns. In Italy, Attila's Huns left fields scorched and villages empty. Each incursion created refugees, spreading hunger and disease. Refugees were one of the defining features of Rome's collapse. Families displaced by war crowded into fortified towns, swelling their populations beyond capacity. Makeshift camps sprang up outside city walls, filled with makeshift huts of wood, mud, and cloth. Conditions were appalling. Food was scarce, water was often contaminated, and disease spread quickly. Refugees relied on charity from churches or on begging. For children growing up in these camps, starvation and illness were constant threats. Women in particular faced brutal hardships. Refugee camps were vulnerable to assault from soldiers or raiders, and women were often victims of sexual violence. Widows and orphans, lacking protection, were easily exploited. Many were forced into servitude, whether as laborers or concubines. The collapse of Roman society stripped away many of the protections women had once enjoyed, leaving them exposed to the harsh realities of survival in a lawless age. Even as the empire crumbled, its officials continued to demand taxes. The system became increasingly oppressive, as fewer and fewer taxpayers were left to support the military and bureaucracy. Imperial agents often demanded payment in kind, grain, livestock, or tools, seizing whatever they needed. For peasants, this meant surrendering the very food they required to live. Those who resisted were punished harshly, sometimes with execution, sometimes by being bound to the land as semi-slaves. Labor obligations also became brutal. Families were forced to provide manpower for public works or military campaigns. Young men were conscripted into armies that offered little chance of survival. Others were made to repair roads, fortifications, or aqueducts, often under harsh conditions and without adequate food. What had once been civic duty now felt like slavery to a failing state. The collapse of sanitation and food supply meant that disease was a constant killer. Crowded living conditions in refugee camps and cities provided breeding grounds for plagues. Epidemics swept through the population, carrying off thousands at a time. Corpses often went unburied, piling up in streets or fields. Families lacked the strength or resources to bury their dead properly, leading to outbreaks of further disease. Medical care was primitive. Physicians existed but were limited in number and knowledge. Most people relied on folk remedies or the prayers of priests. When disease struck, Entire households might perish, leaving homes empty and villages abandoned. Life expectancy plummeted, and for many, survival beyond 30 or 40 years was rare. Rome's cultural achievements, its literature, philosophy, and art, were among its proudest legacies. But during the fall, much of this intellectual world was lost. Schools closed as teachers fled or went unpaid. Libraries were looted or neglected, manuscripts left to rot. Knowledge that had once been widespread became concentrated in monasteries, where monks preserved texts by painstakingly copying them by hand. For the ordinary Roman child, education all but disappeared. A boy who might once have learned Latin grammar, rhetoric, and history was now more likely to labor in fields or serve in a militia. A girl who might once have been part of a wealthy household's cultural life was now married young or forced into servitude. The collapse of education meant that generations grew up without access to Rome's intellectual heritage. For them, the brutality of life was not only physical but also cultural. A narrowing of horizons, a loss of identity. Perhaps the most brutal aspect of Rome's fall was the erosion of identity itself. To be Roman had once been a source of pride. Citizenship carried rights, privileges, and a sense of belonging to the greatest power in the known world. But as the empire crumbled, these meanings dissolved. Under barbarian kings, Roman became a hollow title. The law no longer protected citizens. The state no longer fed them. The legions no longer defended them. Instead, people turned to smaller identities, their village, their king group, their local bishop. For many, this shift meant survival, but it also meant loss. The great dream of Rome, an eternal empire of order, law, and culture, was gone. In its place was a brutal, fractured world where loyalty was personal, not imperial. And yet, amid this brutality, human beings continued to endure. Families clung together. Communities rebuilt after raids. Faith provided solace even when it divided. The church offered charity, however meager. Farmers tilled fields again after they were burned, determined to feed their families. Craftsmen repaired tools, soldiers defended villages, and mothers raised children amid the ruins. The brutality of life during the fall of Rome was undeniable. Hunger, violence, disease, and despair were everywhere. But it was not the end of humanity. It was a transformation, harsh and painful, into a new world. The people who endured Rome's fall carried scars, but they also carried forward traditions, faith, and resilience. From their suffering emerged the seeds of medieval Europe, a reminder that even amid brutality, life goes on. The empire that had once promised order and stability was now only a shadow of itself, and for the people who lived through its collapse, the brutality of daily life was relentless. Each day began not with the sense of security that had once accompanied Roman citizenship but with the gnawing uncertainty of survival. Farmers, artisans, widows, and children alike woke in a world that no longer offered guarantees. Hunger might strike before midday, violence might come with the setting sun, and tomorrow could bring ruin at the hands of soldiers, raiders, or even one's neighbors. In the countryside, the rhythms of agricultural life continued, but they were punctuated by fear. A farmer might rise before dawn to till the soil, only to keep glancing at the horizon, worried that smoke in the distance meant raiders were near. The land, once fertile and carefully managed through Rome's engineering of irrigation and roads, had begun to revert to wilderness. Without proper maintenance, canals silted over, roads crumbled, and bridges collapsed. Moving goods became more dangerous, and markets that had once bustled with exchange grew quiet. Villages clung to survival, living harvest to harvest, with little confidence that they would last another year without disaster. The decay of cities mirrored this rural struggle. Urban life had once been Rome's pride, a testament to its engineering and wealth. Now the cities were husks of their former selves. Markets that had overflowed with spices, fabrics, and grain now displayed only scraps of produce and meager fish. Stalls stood empty, their owners having fled or been ruined. Grand stone basilicas and temples stood neglected, their columns cracked, their steps littered with refuse. The aqueducts that had once brought water into the cities in abundance now leaked or lay dry, forcing citizens to draw water from polluted rivers and wells. Disease spread quickly, and the smell of waste clung to the narrow streets. Fires broke out and spread unchecked, for there were no organized brigades left to contain them. Amid this decay, the people lived lives of fear. Parents tried to protect their children from the knowledge of horrors, but the realities of the age could not be hidden. Children saw corpses lying in the streets after outbreaks of plague. They heard the cries of mothers mourning sons conscripted into armies that would never return. They felt hunger gnawing at their own bellies. Many of these children would not grow to adulthood, and those who did carried the weight of trauma with them. The brutality of these years was magnified by the collapse of authority. Local officials often acted less like servants of the people and more like predators. Tax collectors arrived not as bureaucrats but as armed men demanding tribute. Soldiers, once protectors of the state, frequently took what they pleased: food, coin, livestock, leaving villages destitute. When the poor begged for mercy, their pleas were ignored. Many peasants fled into forests, mountains, or swamps to escape both the empire's officials and the barbarian raiders who threatened them. They became fugitives in their own homeland, cut off from the protections of citizenship and left to survive by whatever means they could. For women, the fall of Rome brought particular dangers. During raids and wars, women were often the most vulnerable, facing not only displacement and starvation but also sexual violence and enslavement. Some were carried off as spoils of war, forced into marriages or servitude in distant lands. Widows, stripped of male protection, struggled to keep households together while raising children alone. Yet within this brutality, women also became central figures of resilience. They managed farms in the absence of husbands, they guarded cultural traditions, and they kept families together amid dislocation. In their hands, fragments of Roman life, language, stories, prayers, were carried forward even as the empire itself crumbled. Religion became both a refuge and a source of conflict. The Christian church had risen to dominance, and in many places, the local bishop was the only authority figure still trusted by the people. Churches became places of sanctuary, where the poor might find bread or where refugees might crowd within stone walls during raids. Yet faith also brought division. Heresies split communities, and clashes between Christians and lingering pagans turned violent. Old temples were desecrated, statues of gods toppled, and ancient rituals banned. For some, this destruction of the old ways felt like the final blow to Roman identity. For others, Christianity provided hope, promising salvation beyond the brutalities of the present world. The brutality of Rome's fall was not only physical but psychological. Generations had grown up under the belief that Rome was eternal, that its armies would always guard its borders, that its emperors would always reign. To witness the empire's disintegration was to suffer a profound loss of identity. Being Roman no longer meant protection or privilege. Instead, it became an empty label, often mocked by invaders who carved up the empire's lands. Men and women who had once seen themselves as citizens of the greatest power in history now felt abandoned, left to navigate a world ruled by warlords and tribal chieftains. Despite the collapse, life went on. People still tilled the soil, raised children, told stories, and sought joy where they could. In the evenings, families might gather around fires, sharing tales of Rome's past glory, almost as if speaking the words aloud could conjure back the security they once knew. Small festivals continued, even if they were stripped of grandeur. A loaf of bread shared among neighbors, a song sung during harvest, or the ringing of church bells could provide a momentary escape from fear. These fragile acts of humanity reminded people that, though Rome was falling, life itself endured. Yet the reality remained brutal. Famine stalked the land with regularity, leaving bodies piled by roadsides. Disease struck indiscriminately, sometimes wiping out entire villages. Armies and raiders trampled across fields, leaving scorched earth in their wake. Even in moments of peace, people lived with the constant memory of violence, never certain when it might return. The collapse of education meant that children no longer read the classics or learned the laws that had once defined Roman civilization. Instead, their education was one of survival: how to forage, how to hide, how to fight. As the empire disintegrated, wealth concentrated in fewer hands. Great landowners retreated to fortified villas, living in relative comfort while peasants toiled around them. The gap between rich and poor grew wider, and resentment simmered. Yet even the wealthy were not safe. Their estates were tempting targets for raiders, and their privileges could vanish overnight if they fell afoul of new rulers. Luxury was fragile, and the fear of losing it shadowed every banquet and feast. The fall of Rome was not a single moment but a long, painful unraveling. To those who lived through it, there was no clear line between empire and post-empire, only the steady erosion of what had once seemed eternal. Each year brought new losses: a city sacked, a road abandoned, a harvest stolen, a family scattered. The brutality was cumulative, pressing down generation after generation until resilience itself became a form of heroism. For the survivors, simply enduring from one season to the next was a triumph. By the end of the 5th century, when the last Western emperor was deposed, many ordinary people scarcely noticed. Their world had already been brutalized beyond recognition. Rome had ceased to be a protector long before its final collapse. What remained was a fragmented landscape of fear, faith, hunger, and endurance. The people who lived through it carried the memory of Rome's greatness, but they bore even more deeply the scars of its fall. The final centuries of Rome's Western Empire were years of unraveling, and the brutality of life during this era was felt in every household, on every road, and in every field. It was a time when survival itself was an achievement, and when the daily routine of ordinary people was constantly threatened by forces beyond their control. The greatness of Rome had once been measured in stone aqueducts, mighty roads, bustling forums, and the unshakable order of its legions. Now that greatness was remembered only in fragments, for in reality the empire was reduced to a patchwork of fragile communities struggling against hunger, fear, and chaos. Life in the countryside, once the heart of Rome's food supply, was especially hard. Farmers had always carried the weight of empire, producing the grain that fed its armies and cities. But as invasions cut trade routes and taxes grew harsher, their burden became unbearable. A farmer who rose with the dawn to plow his land did so with little confidence that he or his family would benefit from the harvest. Soldiers might arrive demanding tribute, tax collectors might seize the best of his grain, or raiders might sweep through and torch the fields before the crops could be reaped. For many, the choice was between surrendering to poverty or abandoning the land altogether. Abandoned farms became overgrown wastelands, symbols of decline where silence replaced the sound of tools and voices. In cities, life was no less brutal. Rome, once the shining jewel of the empire, had by the 5th century become a city of ghosts. The forums were quiet, their marble colonnades scarred by neglect. The amphitheaters that had once roared with the excitement of games now stood hollow, their stones stolen for other buildings, their seats overrun by weeds. The aqueducts no longer carried water in abundance, leaving fountains dry and baths abandoned. Citizens carried buckets to foul rivers, knowing that disease spread through the very water they were forced to drink. The streets, once cleaned by organized labor, stank of refuse. Families crowded into crumbling insulae, fearful of collapse, fire, or thieves. Where once Roman order had ensured a measure of safety, the city had become a place where danger lurked around every corner. Fear of invasion never lifted. Rumors traveled faster than armies, spreading panic from village to village. A farmer seeing smoke in the distance could not know whether it marked a neighbor's cooking fire or the approach of a raiding band. Families huddled in prayer as the thunder of hooves or the clash of steel echoed nearby. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 had shocked the world, but for many outside the capital, such violence was not a rare tragedy but a recurring ordeal. In Gaul, entire towns were razed. In Hispania, the Vandals and Suebi carved out territories at the cost of countless lives. In Italy, the shadow of Attila's Huns left the land blackened by fire. For those who survived, the memory of flight, hunger, and loss haunted them long after the invaders moved on. The displacement of people was one of the most visible marks of the age. Refugees poured into fortified towns, carrying what little they could salvage: tools, a sack of grain, a few family possessions. These towns swelled beyond capacity, and their walls, once symbols of Roman strength, became prisons of desperation. Inside, disease thrived in the overcrowded conditions. Families built makeshift huts of mud and thatch in alleys or courtyards. Children played among refuse, their laughter thin against the background of coughing and weeping. Food ran short quickly and prices soared. The poor sold whatever they owned, from clothing to cooking pots, in order to buy a few days' worth of bread. Many starved anyway, their bodies lying unburied when families were too weak to perform even the simplest burial rites. The army, once the protector of these communities, became a source of dread as often as reassurance. Soldiers who went unpaid looted the very people they were meant to defend. Mercenaries from barbarian tribes fought for Rome one year and against it the next, shifting loyalties according to who offered more coin or land. To see soldiers approaching was no longer a guarantee of safety but a reason to hide valuables, livestock, and even children. Mothers held their little ones close, praying the men would pass without demanding recruits, food, or worse. For families already reeling from hunger and plague, such predation from supposed allies deepened their sense of betrayal. Women bore burdens both visible and unseen. In times of invasion, they often endured the worst of violence, carried away as captives or forced into servitude. Widows became common, left to manage farms and families alone, often targeted by officials who saw them as easy victims for tax demands. Young girls were married early, sometimes to secure alliances or to protect them from being taken by raiders. Yet women also became the quiet backbone of survival. They tended gardens in secret to feed their families, they preserved traditions and stories, and they taught children prayers when schools had long since closed. Their endurance gave shape to communities when men were lost to war or conscription. Religion was both a comfort and a battlefield of its own. The spread of Christianity gave many people hope, a sense that their suffering was not meaningless but part of a larger story of salvation. Churches became sanctuaries, their walls offering physical refuge during raids and their altars promising spiritual consolation. Priests and bishops distributed bread when they could, preached patience and endurance, and reminded their flocks of eternal life beyond the brutality of the present. Yet this faith was not without its own divisions. Doctrinal disputes tore communities apart, and violence sometimes erupted between rival sections. The destruction of pagan temples alienated those who clung to the old gods, while Christians themselves struggled against accusations of heresy. For ordinary people, religion could be both a light in the darkness and another source of strife. Disease stalked every step of life. Without reliable sanitation, outbreaks spread quickly, carried by fleas, rats, and contaminated water. Entire villages could be wiped out within weeks, leaving behind only the silence of abandoned homes. Those who survived illness were often weakened, unable to work the land or bear children. Families that once numbered a dozen might be reduced to only a few, too few to sustain the household. Cemeteries filled faster than graves could be dug, and many bodies were left exposed, prey to scavenging animals. The stench of decay became a part of the landscape, another reminder of the fragility of existence. Amid such suffering, education and culture withered. Schools closed as teachers fled or starved. Libraries, once filled with scrolls and codices, were plundered, their treasures lost to fire or neglect. Children grew up without learning to read, their hands hardened by tools rather than ink. The old stories of Virgil, Cicero, and Livy were no longer part of everyday life. Instead, young people learned how to mend a plow, how to hide from raiders, or how to barter at a market. The intellectual richness of Rome faded, preserved only in monasteries where monks painstakingly copied texts by hand. For most, knowledge became practical and immediate, stripped of the grandeur of Rome's past. The brutality of inequality deepened as well. Wealthy landowners withdrew into fortified estates, living behind walls guarded by private soldiers. Their tables still carried meat, wine, and bread, while peasants outside their walls starved. The divide between rich and poor widened into a gulf, breeding resentment and occasional revolt. Yet even the powerful were not secure. Raiding armies did not spare villas, and ambitious generals might strip aristocrats of their wealth in an instant. No amount of gold could buy true safety in an age where violence dictated fate. And yet, even in this world of constant loss, people clung to life. A mother cradling her child against the cold night, a farmer sowing seeds despite knowing raiders might destroy them, a priest offering bread to the hungry even when his own stomach ached. These were the small acts of endurance that kept the fabric of humanity from tearing completely apart. Festivals were celebrated, though with fewer resources, and songs were sung around fires, though voices often cracked with hunger. In these fragile rituals, people found the strength to face another day. By the end of the 5th century, when Romulus Augustulus was deposed, the brutality of life had already erased much of the old empire from the minds of ordinary Romans. The emperor's fall was only a formality, for the empire had long ceased to serve its people. What remained was a scattered mosaic of kingdoms, villages, and monasteries, each struggling to carve out survival in the ruins of a world that had once believed itself eternal. For those who lived through it, the fall of Rome was not a story of dates and rulers, but of hunger, fear, loss, and the quiet, stubborn determination to endure. The twilight years of the Western Roman Empire were not marked by a single catastrophe but by an endless accumulation of miseries that ground down the lives of its people. Every season brought with it new burdens. Winter carried hunger and cold, spring brought flooding or raids, summer carried disease, and autumn demanded a harvest that was never certain to be reaped. To live in those times was to live beneath a shadow that never lifted, a shadow of fear, of uncertainty, of violence. What had once been called the Pax Romana had collapsed into a patchwork of desperation, and the people who had once looked to emperors and legions for protection were left to fend for themselves in a fractured, brutal world. For the farmer in the provinces, daily life was the heart of this struggle. He rose before dawn, clutching tools worn smooth by generations, and walked into fields that might be his only chance at survival. The soil, once enriched by Rome's network of trade and stable governance, was now difficult to cultivate. Roads that had carried manure, seed, and goods to and from markets were broken, their stones scattered. Irrigation channels clogged with silt and weeds, leaving fields dry or flooded. Wild animals prowled more boldly, reclaiming lands where villages had once flourished. The farmer's hands, cracked and rough, tilled a world that seemed to fight against him. And even if his crops grew tall and green, he knew they might never reach his family's mouths. Soldiers, tax collectors, or marauders could descend at any moment and seize the fruit of his labor. Urban dwellers fared no better. Cities had once been Rome's pride, monuments to its strength and grandeur, but by the 5th century they were decaying shells. The great avenues that had echoed with parades and processions now lay quiet, their stones uneven and their edges overtaken by weeds. Public buildings stood hollow, their statues stolen, their roofs collapsed, their walls covered in soot and grime. The aqueducts that had carried clean water from distant mountains into the heart of cities no longer flowed, leaving fountains dry and baths abandoned. Families crowded into collapsing tenement blocks, cooking fires smoked in hallways, and water was fetched from stagnant wells. The stench of refuse mixed with the sickly sweetness of disease, a constant reminder of death that clung to every street. Fear was the common language of the age. News of approaching armies moved swiftly, often exaggerated, but always enough to ignite terror. Families fled with little more than what they could carry, stumbling onto roads crowded with others in flight. Mothers carried infants, fathers pushed carts piled with meager possessions, children trailed behind barefoot and hungry. Sometimes the enemy never came, and the refugees returned home to find their farms intact. Other times, the rumors proved true, and what awaited them was fire and steel. Raiders burned houses, slaughtered livestock, and cut down those who resisted. Survivors were left amid ashes, their lives reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. The memory of smoke rising against the horizon was one that never left those who endured it. The brutality was not only inflicted by outsiders. The empire's own army, weakened by lack of pay and loyalty, often preyed upon the very people it was meant to protect. A village might cheer at the sight of Roman standards in the distance, only to despair when the soldiers demanded food, shelter, or coin that the peasants could not spare. Recruits were taken from families, young men torn from their homes to fight wars far away. Many never returned, their bones left on foreign soil or their names forgotten in endless battles. To the families they left behind, their loss was both a wound and a warning that loyalty to Rome no longer guaranteed safety. Women bore scars of a different kind. Raids and wars left them vulnerable to violation, abduction, and slavery. A widow without a husband or sons to defend her was exposed to exploitation by both neighbors and officials. Daughters were married young, often out of desperation rather than celebration, their unions formed as shields against poverty or violence. And yet, women also became anchors of survival. They spun thread, baked bread, cared for children, and kept households alive amid destruction. Their resilience, often unrecorded in chronicles, was the quiet force that kept communities from collapse. They taught prayers, passed down stories, and whispered lullabies that reminded children of a gentler world, even as chaos swirled around them. Religion filled the void left by the collapse of civic order. For many, the church was the only institution that still offered comfort and stability. Within its walls, refugees huddled during sieges, and priests offered bread to the hungry. Bells tolled not only for worship but also as alarms, warning of danger on the horizon. Faith gave meaning to suffering, promising that those who endured hardship would find reward in the life to come. Yet religion was not free from conflict. Communities divided over doctrine, and rival sects sometimes turned violence against each other. Temples of the old gods were stripped of treasures, their columns toppled, their rituals banned. For some, this destruction deepened the sense of loss, as if Rome itself were being erased not only from politics and law but from the soul. Disease remained a merciless enemy, striking without warning. The crowded conditions of refugee camps, the collapse of sanitation, and the shortage of food created a perfect breeding ground for plague. Fever swept through villages, taking the weak first but sparing no one. Children wasted away, their bodies too small to fight infection. The old, already frail, succumbed quickly. Even the strong were laid low, leaving families unable to gather harvests or defend themselves. Corpses piled in the streets, and the living grew too weary to bury the dead. Death became an everyday companion, so familiar that grief often turned to numbness. Education, once a mark of Roman civilization, faded into memory for most. Schools closed when teachers fled or starved, and books were lost to fire, neglect, or ignorance. The words of Cicero, Virgil, and Ovid were forgotten outside a few monasteries where monks labored by candlelight to copy ancient texts. Children no longer learned rhetoric or philosophy but instead grew up with the knowledge of toil and survival. A boy's lessons came from the plow and the sword, a girl's from the loom and the hearth. The brilliance of Roman culture dimmed, and with it the sense of belonging to something greater than survival. Inequality grew sharper as the empire fractured. Wealthy landowners withdrew into fortified estates, their walls guarded by private militias. Inside, banquets were still held, and the air was filled with music and laughter. Outside, peasants starved, their children begging at the gates for crumbs. The poor carried the weight of taxes and labor while the rich paid bribes to avoid conscription or tribute. Yet even these great estates were not secure. Invading armies saw them as prizes, and the same walls that protected the wealthy also trapped them when fire and sword came. Privilege could soften life, but it could not protect it. And yet, amid all this brutality, life refused to vanish. Families clung together, rebuilding after destruction. Villages rose again on the ashes of old ones. Songs were sung in defiance of silence, and festivals, though stripped of grandeur, were still held, binding communities together. A farmer planting seed in a scorched field was not only working for food but for hope, a hope that tomorrow might be better. A mother soothing her child in a ruined hut carried within her the stubborn refusal to let despair claim the future. Humanity endured, not through grand victories or mighty empires, but through the quiet persistence of ordinary lives refusing to end. By the time the last emperor of the West was deposed, the empire itself had long since ceased to be the protector of its people. Its fall was less a single blow than the final sigh of a structure already in ruins. For those who had lived through it, the empire's collapse was not marked by politics but by hunger, loss, fear, and survival. Rome had promised eternity but delivered brutality. And yet, through that brutality, its people endured, scarred but unbroken, carrying the fragments of a shattered world into the uncertain dawn of a new age. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire had become a fragile husk of its former self. The brutality of life in these times did not come from one single calamity but from a relentless sequence of hardships that eroded hope year after year. To wake each morning was to confront a new uncertainty. Whether there would be food enough to eat, whether invaders would appear at the horizon, whether disease would sweep through the household, or whether a tax collector or soldier would arrive to demand what little remained. The proud civilization that had once called itself eternal now lived day to day, clinging to survival with trembling hands. The countryside bore the deepest scars of decline. Farms that had once stretched across fertile plains now stood neglected, their fields overrun by weeds, their boundaries broken by wandering animals. A farmer who remained on his land worked in constant anxiety. He bent his back beneath the sun to plow and sow, yet always with the gnawing thought that his labor might be wasted. If raiders came, the crops would be trampled or burned. If soldiers passed through, the harvest would be seized. If drought came, the ground itself would betray him, cracking into dust. And still he worked, for to abandon the field was to abandon life. His children's thin faces watched him from the doorway of their hut, silent reminders of why he endured the endless toil. For families in towns and cities, the harshness took different forms. Markets that had once overflowed with grain, oil, and wine now displayed only scraps. A loaf of bread cost more than a day's labor if it could be found at all. Families bartered clothes, heirlooms, or tools for food, hollowing out their lives of everything except the desperate need to eat. The great baths that had symbolized Roman luxury stood empty, their marble cracked, their waters gone. Fountains no longer splashed in public squares. Instead, children scooped water from muddy puddles, carrying it home in broken pots. The hum of trade and chatter that had once filled streets gave way to silence, broken only by coughing, weeping, or the clatter of hooves announcing the arrival of soldiers. The empire's defenses, once unshakable, now crumbled under pressure. The barbarian tribes that Rome had once held at bay surged across borders with little resistance. The Visigoths carved their path into Gaul and Hispania, leaving smoldering towns in their wake. The Vandals swept into North Africa, severing the empire from its most vital grain supply. The Huns thundered across the plains, their arrival heralded by terror itself. For ordinary people, these names were not matters of politics or history but of dread. Each meant fire, hunger, and loss. Each meant families torn apart, homes abandoned, and futures extinguished. The empire's frontier had collapsed, and with it collapsed the fragile sense of safety that had once bound its people together. In this atmosphere, the Roman army itself became an object of fear. Once disciplined and loyal, it had decayed into a body of mercenaries and opportunists. Soldiers no longer fought for Rome but for pay, and when pay failed, they turned their swords against those they had sworn to protect. A farmer might lose his grain to barbarian raiders one season and to Roman soldiers the next, making little distinction between the two. For villagers, the sight of armed men marching down the road meant hiding livestock, burying coin, and praying that their children would not be seized for conscription. To live under such conditions was to live in a constant state of siege, even without an enemy formally declared. Women endured unique hardships in this unraveling world. Raids left them vulnerable to captivity, assault, and forced servitude. Widowhood became common as wars and plagues claimed husbands and sons, leaving women to bear the double burden of survival and protection. Yet even amid brutality, women carried on the quiet work of sustaining life. They tilled gardens when fields failed, gathered herbs for medicine when physicians were gone, and whispered stories to children when despair threatened to overwhelm them. They became guardians not only of households but of memory, keeping alive the fragments of a culture slipping into ruin. Their strength was seldom written in chronicles, yet it was the thread that bound families together through catastrophe. The role of the church grew larger as the empire withered. Where imperial authority failed, bishops stepped in, organizing relief, mediating disputes, and offering a measure of stability. Churches became fortresses as well as sanctuaries, their walls sheltering the weak during raids. The faithful gathered in darkened halls to pray for deliverance, their voices rising against the silence of fear. The promise of eternal life brought comfort, convincing many that their suffering was not meaningless but part of a divine design. Yet even faith could not shield them from division. Rival interpretations of Christianity led to bitter feuds, sometimes erupting into violence. Pagans mourned the destruction of their temples, their gods silenced by laws and mobs. Religion gave hope, but it also deepened the fractures that weakened communities. Plague remained a silent, remorseless enemy. The collapse of sanitation in cities, the spread of filth in refugee camps, and the scarcity of clean water created fertile ground for epidemics. When sickness came, it came swiftly. Fevers burned through households, leaving children pale and still, mothers coughing blood, fathers too weak to stand. The living often lacked the strength to bury the dead, leaving corpses to rot where they fell. The stench of decay lingered in alleyways and fields alike. For many, life became a cycle of mourning, one loss bleeding into another until grief was dulled by exhaustion. Death was so constant that it no longer shocked, it was simply expected. Knowledge and learning dwindled into fragments. Schools closed, libraries burned or were abandoned, and the voices of the great Roman thinkers faded into silence. Children no longer recited the lines of Virgil or studied the rhetoric of Cicero. Instead, they learned how to grind grain, how to patch walls, how to hide from soldiers. A boy's education became his father's trade, a girl's her mother's tasks. The written word survived mostly in monasteries, where monks scratched letters onto parchment by candlelight. But for most of Rome's people, the intellectual wealth of centuries was beyond reach, replaced by the harsher knowledge of how to endure. Inequality widened into a chasm. The wealthy fortified their villas, surrounding themselves with guards and stockpiles of food, while peasants begged at their gates. Inside, banquets were still held, music played, and wine flowed. Outside, the poor starved, their bodies wasting away within sight of abundance. Anger simmered, sometimes boiling into revolt, but the power of armed guards and private militias kept the desperate at bay. Yet even the wealthy were not safe. Raiders saw their estates as treasure troves, and when the walls were breached, riches could not buy mercy. Privilege offered comfort but never true security. And yet, amid this bleakness, humanity endured. Families rebuilt homes from ashes, planting gardens in the shadow of ruins. Villages gathered to celebrate harvest festivals, even when the harvest was meager, singing songs that reminded them of better days. Children still played in dusty streets, chasing each other with laughter that momentarily drowned out the gloom. Hope lived in these small defiant acts: the planting of a seed, the telling of a story, the lighting of a candle against the darkness. Life continued not because it was easy but because people refused to surrender to despair. By the time the final emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed, the empire's end was less a shock than an inevitability. The people had already lived for years as though the empire were gone, their survival shaped not by laws or legions but by their own resilience. Rome had promised eternity, but its eternity had rotted into brutality. What remained was not the grandeur of empire but the persistence of human spirit, carrying fragments of the old world into a new and uncertain age. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single moment but a drawn-out tragedy, played out over decades in the lives of ordinary people who bore the weight of decline. For them, history was not measured by the rise and fall of emperors but by hunger, fear, and the struggle to endure. Every year brought new burdens, and every household felt the crushing uncertainty of a world without stability. To live in these times was to wake each morning to questions with no answers. Would there be food enough to survive? Would soldiers or raiders arrive before nightfall? Would disease strike again? These questions haunted every village, every city, and every family, shaping a reality where life was stripped down to survival alone. In the countryside, farmers clung stubbornly to their land, though the land itself often betrayed them. Fields that had once produced wheat in abundance now yielded only thin harvests, choked by neglect and exhausted by years of overuse. Without the steady rhythms of Rome's trade networks, tools grew dull, plows broke without iron to repair them, and oxen starved when fodder ran out. The farmer's body bent and hardened with toil, his skin burned by sun and wind, yet his reward was meager and uncertain. He labored not only for his family but for tax collectors who demanded a share even when there was nothing to give. Soldiers and raiders alike stripped away whatever remained. At the end of the season, his granary might stand nearly empty, and his children's thin faces reminded him of the futility of endless labor. Yet still he sowed seeds because to abandon the field was to abandon life itself. The towns offered no greater comfort. Markets were shells of their former selves, where stalls once heaped with grain and fruit now displayed scraps of spoiled food. The old bustle of trade had given way to silence broken only by desperate bargaining. Families huddled in crumbling tenements, their walls damp, their roofs leaking, their hearts cold for lack of wood. Fires burned unchecked in these crowded neighborhoods, consuming entire blocks while neighbors shouted and wept in the smoky night. The aqueducts no longer carried their cool waters, leaving public fountains dry and baths abandoned. Streets that had once echoed with the voices of merchants and children were filled with refuse, their stones cracked and uneven. City life, once the jewel of Roman identity, had become a daily confrontation with filth, disease, and danger. Danger was never far. Rumors of approaching armies moved faster than the armies themselves, spreading dread like wildfire. Refugees clogged the roads, carrying bundles of clothing, sacks of grain, or children too weak to walk. Mothers pressed infants to their chests, fathers pulled crude carts piled with the remnants of a life left behind, and children stumbled barefoot along the roadside. Sometimes, panic proved premature, and families returned home to find their fields untouched. Other times, smoke on the horizon meant ruin. Raiders descended like storms, burning houses, slaughtering livestock, and cutting down those who resisted. The survivors were left among ashes, their lives turned to rubble in hours. The fear of fire and steel became woven into daily existence, an ever-present dread that no prayer or fortress could fully dispel. The army, once Rome's pride, had become another source of suffering. Legionaries of old had marched with discipline and loyalty, but the armies of the 5th century were ragged shadows of their former glory. Many were mercenaries, their allegiance shifting with promises of coin or land. When their pay failed, they looted villages and towns, plundering what little the people had left. To see soldiers approach was no longer to see protectors but predators. Farmers buried their tools and livestock, families hid valuables in walls or fields, and young men fled to the woods rather than risk conscription. The empire that had once guarded its people now preyed upon them, deepening the sense of betrayal that gnawed at the heart of Roman identity. Women endured in ways both visible and unseen. They carried the grief of widows and mothers, losing husbands and sons to wars, plagues, or conscription. Raids often left them exposed to violence and captivity. Yet they also bore the responsibility of keeping life alive when men were gone. They sowed seeds in abandoned gardens, patched clothing until it was threadbare, and nursed the sick with herbs and whispered prayers. They taught children songs and stories, keeping alive memories of Rome's greatness even as the empire itself collapsed. Their endurance was not written in marble or recorded in chronicles, but it was the quiet force that sustained communities in an age of despair. Religion was one of the few refuges left, though even faith bore the marks of conflict. The church provided bread when it could, shelter during raids, and the promise of salvation in the face of endless suffering. Families crowded into dark churches to pray, their voices rising in chants that tried to drown out fear. Bishops and priests became leaders not only of souls but of cities, mediating disputes and organizing defense when imperial officials were absent. Yet Christianity itself was divided, and communities tore themselves apart over rival doctrines. Pagan temples were stripped, their altars desecrated, leaving those who clung to the old gods alienated. Faith gave comfort, but it also deepened divisions, turning spiritual solace into another battlefield. Disease, silent and merciless, struck without warning. Overcrowded towns, filthy streets, and stagnant water made plagues inevitable. Fever swept through families, leaving children lifeless in their mothers' arms, fathers coughing until they collapsed, and the elderly withering in silence. The living often lacked the strength to bury the dead, leaving corpses in fields or stacked in alleys. The air itself carried the stench of decay, and despair hung as heavy as the smell. Death became so common that grief dulled into numb acceptance, and children grew up accustomed to loss as part of life's rhythm. For many, survival meant not only enduring hunger and violence but also outlasting the invisible hand of sickness that stole lives without warning. Knowledge, once the crown of Roman civilization, flickered like a dying flame. Schools closed, libraries crumbled, and scrolls were lost to fire or neglect. Children grew up without learning to read, their education replaced by the lessons of survival, how to plant, how to build, how to hide. A father taught his son how to sharpen a blade, not how to write a verse. A mother taught her daughter how to weave cloth, not how to recite poetry. The great voices of Rome, Cicero, Livy, Virgil, were silenced for most, their words preserved only in monasteries where monks scratched letters onto parchment in dim candlelight. For the majority, intellectual inheritance was replaced by the blunt demands of endurance. Inequality widened into a chasm too deep to bridge. Wealthy aristocrats retreated into fortified villas, guarded by private militias, their tables still laden with bread and meat while peasants starved outside their gates. The poor begged for scraps, their children's ribs showing through thin skin, their eyes hollow with hunger. Anger simmered in the shadows, and sometimes desperation erupted into revolt. Yet armed guards put down uprisings with brutal swiftness, leaving bodies in ditches as warnings. Still, even the rich were not safe. Raiders saw their villas as prizes, and when walls fell, luxury could not buy mercy. In a world of chaos, no one was truly secure, not even those who clung to privilege. And yet, despite the brutality, life refused to vanish completely. Families rebuilt their homes after fires, planting new gardens in the ashes. Villages gathered for festivals, even when food was scarce, singing songs that echoed with memories of better times. Children still laughed in dusty streets, chasing each other in games that made them forget hunger for a moment. A farmer sowed seeds in parched soil, not only in hope of a harvest but in defiance of despair. A mother lit a candle in a church, its small flame a fragile stand against the overwhelming dark. These quiet acts of persistence carried humanity forward when empires failed. By the time the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was dethroned, the empire itself had already withered in the hearts of its people. The political fall was a mere formality, for Rome's promises had long since turned to ash. What remained was not the grandeur of marble cities or disciplined legions but the stubborn resilience of ordinary lives refusing to end. Rome had promised eternity, but in its eternity there was only brutality. And yet, from that brutality, seeds of endurance were sown, seeds that would one day grow into the fragile beginnings of a new world. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not experienced as a sudden crash, but as a long, grinding descent into hardship. For ordinary people, this decline meant waking each day into a world that offered fewer comforts and more dangers. Rome had once stood as the symbol of order, its empire stretching across continents, its armies invincible, its roads connecting distant lands in a web of trade and prosperity. But by the 5th century that order had disintegrated. What remained was a landscape scarred by war, famine, and disease. To live in these times was to carry the constant weight of uncertainty, for no family knew if it would endure another season, another month, even another week. The countryside, which had once sustained the empire, was transformed into a place of fear and scarcity. Farmers continued to sow seeds, but the earth no longer seemed to answer with generosity. Fields lay neglected as families fled or as invaders swept through, burning crops and trampling soil. What little grew was often seized by soldiers or taken as taxes by officials desperate to fund an empire already collapsing. A farmer might watch his children hunger while wagons loaded with grain rattled away under armed guard. To plant was an act of hope, but also of despair, for he knew the harvest might never reach his own table. Abandoned villages dotted the landscape, their houses roofless, their wells dry, their silence broken only by the cry of birds reclaiming what humans had lost. For those in towns and cities, survival carried its own form of brutality. The bustling marketplaces of Rome's golden age had withered into meager gatherings. Merchants who once traded exotic goods now hawked scraps of spoiled bread or a handful of beans. The sound of coin was rare, Bartering replaced currency as people exchanged clothing, tools, or even labor for food. In narrow streets, families crowded into crumbling tenements, their walls cracked, their roofs leaking, their hearts long cold. Fires swept through these wooden structures, consuming whole neighborhoods in hours, leaving behind nothing but ash and mourning. Water, once supplied in abundance by Rome's aqueducts, had become scarce. Children carried clay jars to muddy streams, their small bodies straining beneath the weight of the only lifeline their families possessed. Disease flourished in this environment, spreading silently and swiftly through streets already haunted by hunger. The threat of violence loomed everywhere. The empire's borders had dissolved into porous lines through which invaders poured unchecked. The Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns became not abstract names but living nightmares. Their raids were sudden, brutal, and merciless. Families huddled in their homes at the sound of distant thunder, only to realize it was the pounding of hooves. Villages went up in flames, livestock were slaughtered or driven away, and the elderly who could not flee were cut down where they stood. Survivors often fled into forests or mountains, living as fugitives in the very land they once called home. Refugees filled the roads, their belongings tied in bundles, their children trailing barefoot and wide-eyed, too weary to cry. For many, the road itself became a grave, bodies abandoned where exhaustion or hunger had claimed them. The Roman army, once the shield of the empire, now added to the suffering of its people. No longer the disciplined legions of earlier centuries, it had become a fractured force of mercenaries and desperate men. Their loyalty belonged not to Rome but to whoever could provide pay or plunder. When wages failed, they turned on the very communities they were meant to defend. Farmers watched helplessly as soldiers took livestock, seized tools, or demanded shelter. Young men were conscripted by force, torn from their families to serve in distant campaigns, their return uncertain. Mothers wept as their sons marched away, knowing that the empire devoured lives without mercy. The line between protector and predator blurred, and ordinary people learned to fear Roman soldiers as much as barbarian raiders. Women lived at the center of this storm of chaos. With men killed in battle, lost to disease, or taken as conscripts, women often shouldered the full burden of survival. They managed households, worked fields, and defended children with a ferocity born of desperation. Yet they also bore unique vulnerabilities. Raids and wars left them exposed to violence, captivity, and exploitation. Widows became common, struggling not only with grief but with the practical demands of feeding their families. Young girls were married early, not for joy but as a means of protection or alliance. And yet, in the quiet resilience of women lay much of what held communities together. They kept stories alive, taught prayers, and passed down traditions that gave children a fragile sense of continuity in a collapsing world. In their strength, even amid despair, the flicker of hope remained. Religion became both a sanctuary and a battlefield. As imperial authority crumbled, the church stepped in to provide order where the state could not. Bishops acted as civic leaders, organizing defense, distributing food, and offering consolation. Churches became gathering places not only for worship but for refuge, their stone walls sheltering families during raids. Faith promised salvation, turning suffering into a test that would be rewarded in the life to come. Yet religion also divided communities. Disputes over doctrine ignited bitterness, sometimes erupting into violence between rival sections. Pagan traditions, once at the heart of Roman identity, were dismantled. Temples were stripped, statues toppled, rituals outlawed. For those who still clung to the old gods, this erasure deepened the sense that Rome itself was dying, not only in its politics and armies but in its very soul. Disease was perhaps the most relentless enemy of all. Plagues swept through towns and villages, spreading unchecked in a world without medicine or sanitation. Families watched loved ones waste away in days, their bodies consumed by fever and weakness. Entire households vanished, their homes left abandoned as grim markers of death. The sick were often left alone, isolated out of fear, their cries unanswered. Burials were hasty when they happened at all. More often, corpses lay unburied, prey to scavenging animals. The air reeked of decay, and with it came a numbing acceptance that life could end at any moment. For those who survived, every cough, every fever carried the terror of an unseen killer. Knowledge and learning, once the pride of Rome, dwindled into fragments. The schools that had taught rhetoric, philosophy, and history closed their doors. Teachers fled or starved, and books were lost to fire, neglect, or ignorance. The works of Virgil, Cicero, and Livy survived only in scattered monasteries where monks labored by candlelight, copying texts letter by painstaking letter. For most, such knowledge was inaccessible. Children grew up with practical lessons: how to plow, how to weave, how to mend, how to hide, rather than with poetry or philosophy. The brilliance of Roman culture faded into memory, replaced by the brutal necessities of survival. A boy no longer dreamed of becoming a senator or orator. His dream was to live another day. Inequality sharpened into cruelty. Wealthy landowners withdrew into fortified estates, their walls guarded by private soldiers. Behind those walls they feasted while peasants starved. For the poor, hunger was constant, their children's cries unanswered as their bodies grew frail. Desperation sometimes drove them to revolt, but the rich crushed uprisings with swift brutality. Yet even the wealthy were not immune. Invaders saw their villas as treasures to be plundered, and when walls fell, privilege offered no shield. Gold and silver bought no mercy from raiders who took everything and left only ashes behind. In a collapsing world, even the powerful lived with fear, though their fear was cushioned by luxuries denied to the masses. And yet, amid the brutality, life refused to yield. Villages rebuilt on ruins, their people planting seeds in soil blackened by fire. Families gathered for festivals, singing old songs that reminded them of times when Rome had seemed eternal. Children still played, their laughter echoing in streets where despair had taken root. A candle lit in a church, a story told at a hearth, a field sown with trembling hands. These small acts of defiance carried humanity forward. Though Rome collapsed, the spirit of survival endured. By the time Romulus Augustulus was deposed, the empire's fall was only the final act in a long play of suffering. For its people, Rome had already died, replaced by a daily reality of hunger, fear, and resilience. The marble monuments and gilded palaces had crumbled, but the stubborn endurance of ordinary men and women carried fragments of a shattered world into the uncertain dawn of a new age. Rome had promised eternity, but its eternity proved brutal. Still, from the ashes of that brutality, life endured, fragile yet unbroken. The slow collapse of the Western Roman Empire reshaped the lives of millions in ways that no historian's chronicle can fully capture. For the powerful, it meant the loss of titles and palaces. For the common people, it meant a life steeped in fear, hunger, and exhaustion. Rome's fall was not a singular event but an age of unraveling, where every year seemed to strip away another layer of stability. Those born during its decline never knew the grandeur their grandparents described, only the harsh, unforgiving reality of a world that no longer held together. The brutality of these years was not confined to the battlefield but seeped into every corner of daily life. For the farmer, life was a ceaseless struggle against forces beyond his control. Once, the empire's vast grain networks had ensured steady supplies, but those channels had collapsed. He rose at dawn, shoulders aching, hands calloused, pushing his plow through exhausted soil with a weary ox at his side. The harvest grew smaller each year, blighted by droughts or trampled by passing armies. Even when the fields yielded enough to feed his family, imperial tax collectors arrived to claim their portion. If he failed to pay, he risked losing his land or being pressed into service. And if marauders came before harvest, the grain vanished in smoke and flames, leaving only ash where sustenance should have been. Farming was no longer a path to stability, it was a gamble against hunger, weather, and war, and the odds grew worse with each passing season. In towns and cities, the misery took a different form. Roman infrastructure, once the marvel of the world, decayed before the eyes of its people. Streets cracked and filled with refuse, aqueducts dried up, and public baths fell silent. Families crowded into dilapidated homes, where damp walls bred sickness and roofs leaked cold rain onto straw beds. The once bustling marketplaces now offered only scraps, stale bread, withered vegetables, and the occasional sliver of salted meat. Money had lost its value. Most transactions were made by barter, a pair of sandals traded for a sack of beans, or labor offered in exchange for bread. Hunger hollowed faces and slowed movements. The city, once a symbol of Rome's eternal strength, had become a place of decay, a shell of its former grandeur. Everywhere the threat of violence loomed. The names of invaders, Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, were whispered with dread around cooking fires. Villagers watched the horizon for smoke, the telltale sign of an approaching horde. When raiders arrived, terror spread faster than fire. Horses thundered down roads, warriors shouting in foreign tongues, their blades flashing in the sun. Houses were torched, livestock slaughtered, and anyone who resisted was cut down without mercy. Survivors fled into forests and caves, clutching whatever they could carry, their children stumbling barefoot on stony ground. Refugees clogged the roads, entire families reduced to wandering beggars. Many never made it to safety, Disease, starvation, and exposure claimed them long before they reached another settlement. To live through a raid was to carry scars that never healed, both visible and unseen. The Roman army, once the iron shield of the empire, had become another source of dread. No longer composed of disciplined citizens defending their homeland, it was filled with mercenaries whose loyalty was tied to coin. When their pay lapsed, they turned their weapons against the people they were meant to protect. Soldiers barged into homes, demanding food, bedding, and women. Villagers buried their possessions in fields, hoping to hide them from both army and raiders alike. Families sent their sons into the hills to avoid conscription, knowing that service meant either death or return as a broken man. The empire that had once brought peace now devoured its own people. Women carried burdens unique to this age of collapse. They were left to keep families alive when men were taken by war, conscription, or disease. They worked fields, mended clothes, and scoured woods for herbs to treat the sick. Yet they also bore the brunt of violence. Raids brought the constant threat of assault and captivity, and many women were dragged away as slaves. Widows filled the towns, their black garments a sea of mourning, their grief hardened into resilience. Mothers told children stories of Rome's glory, trying to preserve a spark of hope in hearts darkened by hunger and fear. In their quiet endurance lay much of what kept families and villages alive, though their suffering went largely unrecorded in the chronicles of emperors and battles. Religion offered solace, though even faith bore the marks of conflict. Churches became sanctuaries, their stone walls offering protection during raids, their altars providing bread and hope in times of famine. Bishops emerged as leaders where governors had failed, guiding communities with both prayer and strategy. Families crowded into dim sanctuaries, chanting hymns that rose above fear and hunger. Yet faith was not without strife. Bitter disputes over doctrine divided Christians, and pagan traditions were stamped out with zeal. Temples were desecrated, statues toppled, and ancient rituals outlawed. For those who still clung to the old gods, the destruction of their sacred places deepened the sense of loss. Religion gave comfort, but it also sharpened divisions, making spiritual life another arena of struggle. Disease stalked these years like an invisible predator. Overcrowded towns, filthy streets, and stagnant water invited plague. Fevers swept through households, claiming children in their mothers' arms, cutting down men in the prime of life, and leaving the elderly to die alone. Corpses piled in alleys and fields, their stench thick in the air, the living too weak or fearful to bury them. Fear of contagion drove families to abandon the sick, leaving them to die in isolation. Survival itself became a source of guilt. Why had one child lived while another perished? Why had one mother recovered while another was buried? Disease did not discriminate, it struck poor and rich alike, reminding all that death was never far away. The light of learning, once Rome's pride, flickered and dimmed. Schools closed their doors, teachers vanished, and books fell into ruin. Children grew up illiterate, taught instead how to toil, barter, and endure. The voices of Cicero and Virgil were silenced for most, preserved only in remote monasteries where monks bent over parchment in candlelight, scratching letters with patient hands. The pursuit of knowledge gave way to the pursuit of survival. A boy no longer dreamed of becoming a scholar or an orator. He dreamed of food in his belly and safety for his family. The brilliance of Roman culture receded into memory, leaving only fragments scattered like broken mosaics across a darkening world. Inequality widened the suffering. Wealthy aristocrats withdrew into fortified villas, feasting behind stone walls while peasants starved outside their gates. Their security was temporary, for raiders targeted these villas with special fury, seeking gold and slaves. When those walls fell, privilege vanished in fire and blood. For the poor, life was a constant negotiation with hunger, their children's hollow faces a daily reminder of despair. Desperation drove some to theft or rebellion, but the empire crushed such resistance mercilessly. The gap between rich and poor, already wide, became an abyss, but in the end, no one was spared from the chaos of a collapsing world. And yet, against all odds, people endured. Farmers still tilled their fields, even when armies might destroy them. Families rebuilt homes after raids, planting gardens among ashes. Villages gathered for festivals, singing old songs, their voices rising defiantly against despair. Children laughed as they chased each other through ruined streets, finding joy in a world that seemed to deny it. Mothers whispered prayers over flickering candles, their flames fragile but unyielding. Life persisted in small acts of resilience, stubbornly refusing to vanish. By the time the empire's last emperor was deposed, Rome's fall was already written in the lives of its people. The marble monuments had crumbled, the legions had vanished, the grandeur had turned to dust. What remained was the endurance of ordinary men and women who bore the weight of history on their shoulders. Rome's promise of eternity had proved false, but from the ashes of its brutality, new beginnings would one day emerge. The empire was gone, but humanity endured, scarred yet unbroken. The unraveling of the Western Roman Empire was not simply a collapse of government or armies, but the slow crushing of ordinary lives under relentless weight. To live in those years was to endure hunger, fear, and grief as constant companions. Rome had promised peace and prosperity, had built roads and aqueducts to bind its people together, had filled markets with goods from across the known world. But by the 5th century, those promises had dissolved into ash. The empire no longer protected its citizens. Instead, it drained them. People were left stranded in a broken system, forced to make choices between impossible evils, surviving one day only to face the same terrors the next. In the countryside, farming remained the backbone of survival, but it had become a brutal and unforgiving existence. Farmers woke with the first light, pushing their weary bodies into the fields even when they knew the land could not sustain them. Droughts dried the soil into dust, rains flooded unprepared valleys, and pests devoured fragile crops. If a family managed to gather enough to eat, soldiers or raiders often seized it. Farmers learned to hide their grain in pits beneath the earth, covering them with stones and soil, yet even these stores were sometimes discovered and stolen. Hunger gnawed at households with a steady cruelty, thinning faces, weakening bodies, and stealing the strength needed to work the land. Children carried bundles of kindling on spindly legs, their bellies bloated with malnutrition. Farming was no longer a life of steady rhythm but of constant fear that all labor might be for nothing. Towns and cities, once the centers of Roman life, offered little refuge. The grand structures of earlier centuries, amphitheaters, temples, baths, stood as hollow relics, their stones crumbling, their splendor wasted. Marketplaces were silent, stalls empty or filled with goods so scarce that only the wealthy could buy them. In narrow streets, waste piled high, turning alleys into breeding grounds for rats and disease. Families shared cramped rooms, where dampness rotted wood and mold spread across walls. Water, once delivered through aqueducts, now had to be drawn from polluted rivers or shallow wells. Mothers dipped jars into muddy pools, whispering prayers that the water would not carry death back to their children. Fires frequently consumed entire neighborhoods, sparked by cooking embers or the careless flames of desperate families trying to stay warm. City life, once the pride of Roman identity, became a daily contest against filth, hunger, and despair. Everywhere, the threat of violence shadowed existence. In villages, rumors spread quickly. Raiders had been seen on the horizon or a nearby town had been sacked. Families fled in haste, grabbing what they could carry. Roads filled with terrified refugees, their faces pale with exhaustion. Mothers cradled infants against their chests, fathers pulled carts piled with meager possessions, and children stumbled barefoot, too tired to cry. When raiders came, they brought fire and steel. Houses burned, animals were slaughtered or stolen, and the old who could not flee were left behind to face brutal deaths. Survivors wandered homeless, their villages reduced to blackened ruins. Fear of these raids became part of daily life, shaping choices, dreams, and even prayers. The Roman army, once a disciplined and proud institution, had become both predator and protector. Legionaries had been replaced with mercenaries, men who fought for coin rather than loyalty. They arrived in towns demanding food, shelter, and tribute. If refused, they took what they wanted by force. Villagers learned to fear the sight of Roman banners almost as much as barbarian ones. Young men were seized for conscription, torn from their families and marched away to fight wars they barely understood. Many never returned. Those who did often came back broken in body and spirit, their eyes hollow with memories of violence. The empire that had once been shield and sword for its people had become an oppressor, turning survival itself into a betrayal of trust. Women bore a particularly heavy burden. With men absent, lost to battle, conscription, or disease, women became the backbone of survival. They managed fields, raised children, and tended to the sick, all while carrying the constant fear of raids and violence. Many were widowed young, forced to raise families alone in a world where survival was already tenuous. Raids brought particular terror, for women were often dragged away as captives, their fates sealed in foreign lands. Those who remained carried grief like a cloak, yet their resilience was extraordinary. They stitched clothes from rags, gathered herbs for remedies, and whispered stories to children at night to soothe fear. In their strength lay much of the endurance that allowed communities to carry on through collapse. Religion became both a lifeline and a battlefield. The church stepped into the void left by the empire, offering food, shelter, and hope. Bishops became leaders not only of faith but of cities, guiding communities through famine and raids. Churches became fortresses of both stone and belief, their walls offering physical and spiritual refuge. People crowded inside, clutching one another during attacks, chanting hymns that rose above the chaos. Faith promised salvation, offering meaning in suffering, a vision of eternal life beyond the brutality of the present. Yet religion also divided communities. Arguments over doctrine created bitter schisms, turning neighbor against neighbor. Pagan temples were destroyed, statues shattered, rituals erased. For those who still clung to the old gods, this was another loss, a further unraveling of identity. Religion gave comfort, but it also sharpened wounds, layering spiritual conflict atop physical survival. Disease remained an ever-present terror, striking silently and without warning. Plagues swept through villages and towns, leaving bodies piled in streets and fields. Fever burned through families, sparing some and killing others without reason. Parents buried children, children buried parents, and the air itself carried the reek of death. In some towns, the living could not keep pace with the dead, leaving corpses unburied as grim reminders of mortality. Fear of contagion drove families to abandon their sick, leaving them to die alone. Survival came with guilt, for to live while others perished often felt like a cruel twist of fate. In these years, disease seemed not merely a natural force but a punishment, a shadow that stalked every home. The collapse of learning deepened the darkness. Schools closed their doors, teachers vanished, and libraries crumbled. The wisdom of centuries was reduced to scraps, preserved only in remote monasteries where monks bent over parchment in flickering candlelight. For most, literacy was a luxury they would never know. Children were taught not letters or philosophy but skills for survival: how to dig, how to weave, how to mend, how to hide. The voices of Rome's greatest thinkers fell silent for the common people, replaced by the hard lessons of hunger and endurance. Culture narrowed to what could be carried, spoken, or remembered, passed down not through scrolls but through whispers at firesides. The intellectual light of Rome flickered in the distance, unreachable for those trapped in the brutal struggle of daily life. Inequality cast its shadow across every aspect of decline. Wealthy aristocrats retreated behind fortified walls, their tables laden with bread, wine, and meat while peasants starved outside their gates. They feasted in candlelit halls while the poor huddled in darkness, their ribs showing through thin skin. Anger simmered, and sometimes desperation exploded into revolt, but armed guards swiftly crushed such uprisings, leaving bodies as warnings. Yet even the wealthy were not safe. Raiders saw their villas as prizes, storming walls, looting treasures, and carrying away captives. Privilege offered temporary comfort but no immunity. In the end, all were vulnerable to the same fate: hunger, fire, disease, and death. And yet, amid ruin, life refused to disappear. Families rebuilt homes from rubble, planting gardens where ashes lay. Villages gathered for festivals, sharing songs and dances that carried echoes of a brighter past. Children laughed in the streets, their games momentarily pushing aside fear and hunger. Farmers sowed seeds not only in hope of harvest but as acts of defiance against despair. Mothers lit candles in churches, their flames flickering but unyielding, symbols of faith that even collapse could not extinguish. These small acts of endurance carried humanity forward, planting fragile roots in the soil of destruction. By the time the last emperor was deposed, Rome's fall had already been written into the lives of its people. The marble monuments had crumbled, the legions had vanished, the grandeur had turned to dust. What remained was survival, the determination of ordinary men and women to endure, to rebuild, to pass fragments of their world into an uncertain future. Rome had promised eternity, but its eternity was brutal, and from that brutality rose the stubborn, quiet endurance of life itself. The fall of Rome was not a single catastrophe but a storm that stretched across generations, breaking down the lives of ordinary people bit by bit. It was a slow suffocation, a grinding away of stability until nothing remained but survival. For those who lived through it, Rome's collapse was not measured in emperors dethroned or borders redrawn but in empty stomachs, ruined homes, and loved ones lost. The people of this age awoke each morning into a world that seemed to grow smaller, harsher, and more uncertain. Hope itself became fragile, flickering like a candle in the wind. In the countryside, farming families bore the heaviest burden. The soil, once fertile and tended with tools crafted by Roman blacksmiths, grew harder with every passing year. Without trade networks to provide iron, plows grew dull, Without beasts of burden, fields had to be tilled by weary human hands. The farmer's life became one of desperate improvisation. He patched broken tools with scraps of wood, sharpened blades against rough stone, and prayed for rains that never seemed to come. His children walked beside him, scattering seeds into the ground, their eyes hollow from hunger. Each harvest brought less than the last, and much of what was gathered was claimed by tax collectors or seized by passing soldiers. To feed his family, the farmer often resorted to hiding sacks of grain beneath the earth, burying them like treasure. But soldiers and raiders were ruthless in their searches, leaving entire households destitute. Farming had once been the backbone of Rome's wealth. Now it was a gamble with survival as the only prize. Towns and cities, once glittering with marble and bustling with trade, decayed into shadows of themselves. Aqueducts cracked, their waters no longer flowing into fountains or baths. Streets filled with refuse, their stones broken and uneven. The marketplaces, once alive with the chatter of merchants and the clink of coins, now offered little more than wilted vegetables, stale bread, or thin soups. Money had lost its value. Barter became the only language of survival. Families traded clothing for food, labor for shelter, and sometimes even children for safety. Tenements crumbled, their walls sagging, their roofs leaking in the rain. Fires often consumed entire districts, unchecked in a world where public services no longer functioned. People slept with the constant smell of smoke in their nostrils, fearing that the next spark would leave them homeless. City life, once the symbol of Roman greatness, had become an ordeal of hunger, filth, and fear. Violence stalked the land without rest. Raiders descended upon villages like storms, their swords and torches leaving only ruins behind. Survivors fled into forests and caves, clutching children to their chests, their homes still burning on the horizon. Refugees crowded the roads, their belongings carried in bundles, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Many died along the way, of hunger, of thirst, of exposure, and their bodies were left by the roadside, grim markers of the path of despair. In this world, no settlement was safe, no family secure. At night, people listened for the distant thunder of hooves, the cries of warriors, the crackle of fire. Fear was constant, pressing down on hearts with every passing day. The army, once Rome's shield, had become its predator. No longer disciplined legions, the troops were mercenaries, men who fought for coin, not loyalty. When their pay failed, they turned on the people they were meant to protect. Villagers learned to dread the arrival of soldiers as much as raiders, for both brought plunder and cruelty. Homes were stripped of food and valuables, families forced to house men who offered no gratitude, only threats. Young men were pressed into service against their will, torn from their families to fight in wars they could not understand. Many never returned. Mothers wept silently at night, knowing their sons were swallowed by the maw of an empire that consumed lives and gave nothing back. Rome's army, once the pride of the world, had become another instrument of suffering. Women bore the quiet strength of survival, though their suffering was immense. With men gone to war or lost to disease, women kept households alive. They tilled fields, spun wool, baked bread from dwindling stores, and tended to the sick with herbs gathered from the wild. Yet they lived in constant fear of violence. Raids brought particular terror, for women were often taken as slaves or subjected to brutality. Widows became countless, their black garments a common sight in villages and cities alike. Despite the grief, they carried on, raising children, teaching them fragments of culture, and passing on stories of Rome's greatness even as it lay in ruins. Their endurance was unrecorded in history books but was the invisible force that kept families and communities alive. Religion offered solace but also division. The church became the center of life, its bishops acting as leaders where governors had failed. Churches offered bread to the hungry, shelter to the displaced, and words of hope to the grieving. Families crowded into sanctuaries during raids, praying beneath stone arches while torches burned outside. Faith turned suffering into something bearable, a test of endurance that promised eternal reward. Yet religion also became a source of conflict. Doctrinal disputes divided communities, neighbors turning against each other in arguments over belief. Pagan temples were torn down, their altars desecrated, their worshippers scorned. For those who still clung to the old gods, this was yet another loss, a piece of Rome's soul stripped away. Faith gave hope, but it also deepened wounds, layering spiritual struggle atop physical suffering. Disease haunted the land with invisible terror. Plagues swept through crowded towns and vulnerable villages alike, leaving families broken and streets filled with corpses. Fever consumed children in days, left mothers coughing until they could no longer breathe, and took fathers in the midst of labor. The living often lacked the strength to bury the dead. Bodies lay unburied, rotting in fields and alleys. The stench of decay clung to everything, a constant reminder of mortality. People whispered that the gods were angry, that the world itself was punishing them. To survive disease was both blessing and curse, for it left survivors haunted by the faces of those they had lost. Death had become so common that grief dulled into numb acceptance, another part of the brutal rhythm of life. Learning and culture, once Rome's pride, dimmed into near darkness. Schools were abandoned, libraries destroyed, books burned for fuel in the cold. Knowledge was preserved only in monasteries, where monks copied texts by candlelight, scratching words into parchment with fragile hope that wisdom might survive. For most, literacy became a luxury lost. Children grew up learning to survive, not to read. Their lessons were practical: how to plow, how to weave, how to hide during raids. The grand voices of Roman culture, poets, historians, philosophers, were silenced for the masses. Culture shrank into the bare necessities of life, its brilliance replaced by hunger, fear, and endurance. Inequality deepened the suffering. The wealthy retreated behind fortified walls, their tables still heavy with bread and meat, while the poor starved outside their gates. Aristocrats hired private guards, but even their walls could not hold forever. Raiders stormed villas, stripping them of treasures, dragging away their families. Privilege offered temporary comfort, but no one was safe in a collapsing world. For the poor, desperation was constant. They scavenged for scraps, bartered what little they owned, and begged for mercy at the gates of the rich. Anger boiled beneath the surface, and sometimes it erupted in rebellion, but such uprisings were crushed with swift brutality. The divide between rich and poor became unbridgeable, yet in the end, both were swallowed by the chaos of Rome's fall. And still life endured. Farmers planted new seeds in blackened soil, even when they feared raiders might come again. Families rebuilt homes from rubble, patching roofs with scraps of wood and clay. Villages gathered for festivals, their songs and dances fragile acts of defiance against despair. Children laughed in the streets, their games echoing with resilience. Mothers lit candles in churches, their flames trembling but unyielding, symbols of a hope that refused to die. These small acts of endurance carried humanity forward, planting roots in the ashes of collapse. By the time the last emperor was dethroned, Rome had already fallen in the lives of its people. The marble monuments had cracked, the legions had vanished, and the grandeur had withered into dust. What remained was survival, the stubborn persistence of ordinary men and women who carried fragments of a dying world into an uncertain dawn. Rome had promised eternity, but eternity proved brutal. Yet from that brutality, life continued, fragile but unbroken. The collapse of Rome was not an event people read about in chronicles or learned from historians. It was an ordeal they lived day by day, written into their bodies and memories. To exist in those years was to walk through a landscape of loss, where everything that once gave life structure and safety had unraveled. The empire that had once stretched across continents now felt like a broken skeleton, its bones scattered across a darkening world. And for ordinary people, survival was less about politics or emperors and more about the endless fight against hunger, violence, and despair. In the countryside, families clung desperately to the land, even as it betrayed them. Fields that had once yielded abundant harvests now offered only meager crops, battered by unpredictable weather and exhausted by overuse. Without Rome's trade networks to deliver tools or animals, farming became back-breaking drudgery, carried out with wooden plows that splintered easily and oxen too weak to pull. Men and women rose before dawn, their breath clouding in the cold, their bodies already aching before a single furrow had been dug. Children carried water from distant streams, their bare feet bleeding from sharp stones. What food the land did give was often seized by tax collectors or raiding bands, leaving families hungry despite their toil. Mothers stretched thin rations by boiling watery stews, whispering lies of plenty to soothe crying children. Hunger was a constant companion, a slow and merciless torment. The villages scattered across the countryside fared no better. Houses were little more than huts of wood and clay, patched again and again after raids or storms. Roofs leaked, walls sagged, and floors were hard-packed earth that turned to mud in the rains. Fires warmed these homes but also threatened to consume them, and when one dwelling caught flame, often the entire village was lost. When raiders appeared, villagers had little defense beyond flight. Families snatched what belongings they could carry and fled into forests, leaving homes to burn and livestock to be stolen. Some returned later to rebuild from ashes, while others never returned at all, joining the tide of refugees who wandered broken roads in search of safety. Cities, once the pride of Rome, had become hollow shells of their former selves. Their grand amphitheaters, temples, and baths stood silent, their stones crumbling, their purposes forgotten. Marketplaces were thin and lifeless, with only a few stalls offering stale bread or wilted vegetables. The coins that once rang through these spaces had lost their value. Now barter ruled, and people traded scraps of clothing for morsels of food. The aqueducts that had once poured clean water into fountains and baths had fallen into disrepair, leaving residents to draw from wells fouled with waste. Streets filled with refuse and sewage, spreading disease through crowded tenements where families huddled together in damp, dark rooms. In the nights, the city was not alive with music or laughter but with the cries of the desperate and the groans of the sick. Rome's urban life, once a marvel of civilization, had dissolved into misery. The shadow of violence never lifted. Raiders, mercenaries, and even Rome's own soldiers descended upon communities without warning. Villagers learned to hide grain beneath floorboards or bury valuables in secret pits, but soldiers were ruthless in their searches. Homes were torn apart and families beaten if they resisted. Children watched their fathers struck down, their mothers dragged away, their homes set aflame. The memory of such violence lingered for years, carried like invisible scars. On roads, travelers risked ambush by bandits, and many who left home never returned. Violence was not an occasional tragedy but a constant presence, shaping every decision. To stay in one place was dangerous, to move was equally perilous. In such a world, safety itself became a memory. The Roman army, which had once been the most formidable in the world, had transformed into a threat. Once loyal legions, disciplined and proud, had given way to mercenary forces who fought not for Rome but for coin. When their wages failed, they turned to pillage. They took food from the hungry, shelter from the poor, and demanded obedience through violence. Families feared their approach as much as that of raiders. Sons were conscripted against their will, marched away to wars that had no meaning for them, leaving families without their strongest laborers. Many never returned, and those who did were broken, scarred, maimed, or hollowed by memories. The empire had become a devourer of its own people, consuming lives to prolong its dying breath. For women, life was particularly harsh. With men lost to battle, disease, or forced labor, women became the pillars of survival. They tilled fields, baked bread, tended to the sick, and raised children in a world that offered little hope. They bore the grief of widows, the terror of raids, and the endless burden of keeping families alive. Many were forced into marriages for protection or seized as spoils of war. Their strength was rarely acknowledged, yet it was the thread that held communities together. In the quiet hours of night, when children cried from hunger and the wind howled through broken roofs, it was mothers and grandmothers who whispered lullabies, who kept the fragile spark of hope alive. Their endurance, though unrecorded, was monumental. Religion became both refuge and battlefield. Churches became sanctuaries where the desperate sought not only food and shelter but meaning. Bishops rose as leaders, guiding communities in the absence of Roman governors, distributing bread and offering words of hope. Faith transformed suffering into a test, promising reward beyond death. People crowded into stone churches during raids, clutching one another, chanting prayers while flames and screams echoed outside. Yet religion also sowed division. Doctrinal disputes split communities, pitting Christian against Christian, and pagan practices were stamped out with ruthless zeal. Temples that had stood for centuries were torn down, their gods silenced. For some, this was another wound, another fragment of identity lost in the collapse. Religion offered comfort, but it also sharpened divisions, turning neighbors into enemies. Disease spread like a curse over the land. Plagues swept through villages and towns, killing without mercy. Fever burned through families, leaving only a few survivors to bury the dead. The living often lacked the strength to dig graves, leaving bodies unburied to rot in streets and fields. The stench of death clung to the air, and fear of contagion drove families to abandon the sick. Survival became a lonely, guilt-ridden experience. Those who lived often did so by leaving others behind. Parents buried children, children buried parents. Communities were hollowed out, reduced to silence by unseen killers. Disease was relentless, and in a world already weakened by hunger and war, it struck with devastating power. The decline of learning deepened the darkness. Schools closed, teachers disappeared, and libraries fell to ruin. The knowledge that had once defined Rome's greatness, its philosophy, literature, and science, was left to wither. Only in distant monasteries did monks labor by candlelight, copying ancient texts with fragile hands, preserving scraps of wisdom for an uncertain future. For ordinary people, learning meant survival skills: how to mend, how to weave, how to dig, how to hide. Children grew up without letters, their futures narrowed to toil. The voices of Cicero, Virgil, and Livy fell silent, their words surviving only in ink and memory far from the reach of the masses. A cultural silence descended, broken only by the cries of hunger and the prayers of the faithful. The chasm between rich and poor widened into a gulf. Aristocrats retreated into fortified villas, their tables laden with food while peasants starved outside their gates. They surrounded themselves with guards, but even wealth offered no safety forever. Raiders saw these estates as prizes, storming their walls, looting treasures, and carrying off their families. The poor, meanwhile, suffered constantly, scavenging for scraps, begging for mercy, bartering away their last possessions. Anger sometimes erupted into revolt, but rebellion was crushed swiftly and mercilessly, leaving corpses as warnings. Inequality was a cruel truth, yet in the end both rich and poor were vulnerable to the same fate: death by hunger, sword, or plague. Yet life endured even in the face of such brutality. Families rebuilt homes from rubble, patching roofs with broken tiles and scraps of wood. Farmers planted seeds in blackened soil, praying for harvests that might never come. Villages gathered for festivals, singing songs that carried faint echoes of a brighter past. Children laughed in the streets, their games pushing aside fear for a moment. Mothers lit candles in churches, their flames trembling but unbroken, symbols of resilience. Survival itself became an act of defiance, a refusal to surrender to despair. Humanity clung to life, fragile yet unyielding, carrying fragments of Rome into an uncertain dawn. By the time the last emperor was dethroned, Rome had already fallen in the lives of its people. The grandeur of marble monuments and armies had vanished, but what remained was survival, the quiet strength of ordinary men and women who endured, who rebuilt, who passed on what fragments they could. Rome had promised eternity, but its eternity was brutal. And yet, through that brutality, life continued, fragile but unbroken, planting the seeds of the world that would follow. The fall of Rome was not felt most keenly in the palaces of emperors or the chambers of generals, but in the huts of farmers, the alleys of cities, and the hearts of families who struggled to survive. To live in that age was to inhabit a world stripped of its promises, where each day presented a new trial and where hope itself felt like a fragile luxury. The grandeur of the empire, its marble columns, its glittering forums, its disciplined legions, was already a memory by the time ordinary people realized how far their world had crumbled. What remained was survival, often bitter and always brutal, carried out by men and women who had little choice but to endure. In the countryside, peasants clung desperately to the land even as it turned against them. The soil had been worked too hard, drained of fertility by centuries of relentless cultivation. Fields that once yielded golden waves of grain now offered meager stalks, thin and brittle. Farmers pushed their bodies to exhaustion, tilling with wooden tools patched and repatched, driving oxen that were little more than skin and bone. When the harvest came, much of it was taken by tax collectors or seized by soldiers, leaving only scraps for the families who had labored for it. Hunger hollowed out their faces, sapped their strength, and left them vulnerable to sickness. Mothers diluted thin porridge with water, stretching it so that every child had at least a taste, though none were ever truly satisfied. Hunger was no longer an occasional misfortune but a permanent feature of life. The villages scattered across the countryside became fragile havens. Their huts, built from clay, wood, and straw, barely withstood the elements. Roofs leaked in the rains, winds tore through cracks, and in winter the cold seeped into every bone. Families huddled together for warmth, their breath clouding in the air as they slept in piles beneath threadbare blankets. Fires provided heat but also constant danger. A single spark could spread through a cluster of homes, consuming everything in moments. When raiders descended, villages offered little resistance. Families fled into the woods, abandoning their homes to flames and pillage. Children wept as they left behind toys carved from scraps of wood, and elders who could not run were left to face terrible fates. For those who survived, rebuilding meant gathering what rubble remained, patching walls with mud, and beginning again in fear that destruction would return. Cities, once symbols of Roman prosperity, decayed into places of despair. Aqueducts, neglected and broken, no longer carried clean water into fountains or baths. People fetched water from shallow wells and rivers, their surfaces slick with waste and disease. Streets filled with refuse, turning into breeding grounds for rats that carried plague. Grand temples stood deserted, their statues toppled, their stones stolen for firewood or patching walls. Marketplaces, once alive with traders from across the empire, were now bare, their stalls occupied by beggars holding out hands for alms that never came. Tenements crumbled, their walls sagging, their stairways collapsing. Families crowded into single dark rooms, the air thick with smoke and sickness. Fires consumed entire districts, spreading unchecked through wooden beams and dry thatch. The city was no longer a beacon of civilization but a prison of poverty, disease, and fear. Violence lay like a shadow over all. Raiders from beyond the empire's borders swept across towns and villages, leaving devastation in their wake. They carried off livestock, set homes ablaze, and slew those too slow to flee. Families who had lived for generations on the same patch of land suddenly found themselves homeless, wandering the roads with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Refugees clogged the countryside, their faces gaunt, their children barefoot and crying. Bandits preyed upon them, stripping them of what little they carried. To walk a road was to risk death, yet to stay was to invite it as well. No corner of the empire was safe. Violence did not strike once and pass, it was a constant, unrelenting threat, shaping the rhythm of every day. The army, once the pride of Rome, had become its tormentor. Once disciplined legions were now fragmented bands of mercenaries, men who fought not for honor but for pay. When wages did not arrive, they turned their blades on the very people they were meant to defend. Soldiers demanded food and shelter, seizing both with violence if denied. Farmers hid their sons, fearing conscription would carry them away into wars from which they would never return. Those who were taken left behind fields that went untended, families that starved. The army no longer shielded Rome, it consumed it, draining its people of strength, resources, and hope. The sight of soldiers marching into a village was as feared as the sight of raiders, for both brought ruin in their wake. Women bore immense burdens in this brutal world. With men gone, taken by war, plague, or hunger, women carried the full weight of survival. They tilled fields, wove cloth, fetched water, and cared for children, their backs bent beneath the strain. They were the healers, gathering herbs to fight fevers and tending wounds with what little they had. They bore the grief of widows and the terror of raids, often becoming the targets of violence themselves. Yet their endurance was remarkable. In their whispered lullabies to children, in the bread stretched to feed one more mouth, in the quiet prayers spoken over graves, they carried the strength of their communities. History would not record their names, but without them, survival itself would have faltered. Religion became the anchor of many lives. The church offered more than prayers. It provided bread, shelter, and leadership where the empire had failed. Bishops became the guardians of towns, guiding their people through famine and war. Churches became sanctuaries, both spiritual and physical, their stone walls places of refuge during raids. Inside, candles flickered as people prayed for mercy, for strength, for meaning in their suffering. Faith gave them a way to endure, turning agony into a test, promising eternal reward beyond the misery of life. Yet religion also divided. Arguments over doctrine split communities, and the destruction of pagan temples tore away ancient traditions. Some clung fiercely to the old gods, others embraced the new faith with desperate devotion. Religion brought comfort, but it also fractured identities, layering spiritual conflict upon worldly despair. Disease struck like an unseen enemy, claiming lives in silence and swiftness. Plagues swept through villages and towns, sparing some and killing others without reason. Fever burned through households, leaving children orphaned and families decimated. Corpses lay unburied when survivors lacked the strength to dig graves. The smell of decay became familiar, mingling with smoke and filth in the air. People whispered that the gods were angry, that the world was ending. Those who survived carried guilt, haunted by the faces of those they could not save. Communities were hollowed out, their voices silenced by death, their futures darkened by fear of the next wave of sickness. The collapse of learning deepened the darkness. Schools closed, their teachers gone, their doors left to rot. Libraries fell into ruin, scrolls and codices destroyed by fire, moisture, or neglect. The wisdom of centuries, of poets, historians, and philosophers, was scattered to the winds. In distant monasteries, monks bent over parchment, copying texts with painstaking care, preserving fragments of Rome's knowledge. But for most, literacy faded into obscurity. Children learned not letters but skills for survival, how to plant, how to mend, how to hide. The brilliance of Roman culture dimmed into memory, replaced by the immediacy of hunger and fear. Inequality remained a cruel and constant reality. The wealthy retreated into fortified estates, their walls high, their guards armed. Inside, tables groaned with food and wine while peasants starved beyond the gates. Yet even the rich were not immune. Raiders targeted villas as prizes, breaking down gates, looting treasures and carrying off their inhabitants. Wealth bought temporary comfort but no safety from the chaos of a collapsing world. The poor bore the harshest burden, scavenging for scraps, selling what little they owned, and begging for mercy from the powerful. Sometimes anger erupted into revolt, but such uprisings were swiftly crushed, leaving fields soaked with blood. Inequality was the fabric of life, but in the end, all were bound to the same fate of hunger, violence, and fear. And yet, amid so much ruin, life did not vanish. Families rebuilt homes again and again, refusing to surrender. Farmers planted seeds in barren soil, their work acts of defiance against despair. Villages gathered for festivals, singing songs and telling stories that carried faint echoes of a brighter past. Children still laughed, their games chasing away fear for moments at a time. Mothers lit candles in churches, their flames trembling but unyielding, symbols of hope that refused to die. Even in the darkest times, humanity endured, fragile but unbroken, carrying fragments of Rome into an uncertain dawn. By the time the empire's final emperor was dethroned, the collapse had already been written into the lives of its people. The grandeur of marble monuments and mighty armies had dissolved, but survival remained. Rome had promised eternity, but its eternity proved brutal. And yet, from that brutality rose the quiet strength of ordinary men and women who endured, who rebuilt, who carried fragments of their world into the future. Their endurance was the true legacy of Rome's fall, not its lost grandeur but its stubborn, unyielding humanity. By the time Rome's empire staggered into its final century, the great machinery of civilization had already broken down for ordinary people. What had once been a world bound together by roads, law, trade, and armies had unraveled into scattered fragments. Across the countryside and in the ruins of cities, people lived as if standing on shifting ground, never sure what the next day would bring. Survival, stripped of all grandeur, became the only goal. To those who lived through it, the fall of Rome was not some sudden cataclysm but an unending series of burdens. Hunger that hollowed their bodies, violence that tore apart their homes, and grief that left scars deeper than wounds. For those who tilled the soil, life had become an endless struggle. The farmer who once grew enough to feed his family and trade in markets now battled against exhausted fields and broken tools. Without steady access to iron, plows dulled quickly, and wooden replacements splintered under strain. Oxen, once strong and plentiful, were lost to raiders or starvation, leaving men and women to drag crude harnesses through the dirt themselves. The weather added its cruelty, droughts cracked the soil, rains washed away seeds and early frosts destroyed fragile sprouts. Every harvest was uncertain, and even the meager yields were often taken by tax collectors or seized by soldiers. Families were left with only scraps, their meals reduced to thin gruel and stale bread. Hunger etched itself into every face, turning children frail and adults prematurely aged. The farmer's field, once a place of sustenance, became a battlefield where he fought endlessly against despair. Villages that had once been places of stability became fragile and temporary. Their huts of mud and timber barely held together through storms, and roofs of thatch leaked with every rainfall. Winter brought biting winds that cut through walls, leaving families huddled together around small fires that filled their homes with smoke. Fires, though life-giving, were also dangerous. One stray spark could ignite a cluster of homes, turning a village to ash within hours. And raids brought destruction far more quickly than weather or flame. At the sound of hoofbeats, villagers fled into forests, abandoning their homes to be plundered. Livestock were driven off, fields trampled and houses burned. Those too slow to run, children, the sick, the elderly, were left to terrible fates. Afterward, survivors returned to blackened ruins, gathering stones and scraps of wood to begin again, knowing they might rebuild only to lose everything once more. In the cities, the decay was even starker. Rome had once dazzled the world with its aqueducts, its marble temples, its sprawling baths and markets. By the empire's twilight, these wonders stood in ruin. Aqueducts cracked and collapsed, leaving fountains dry and baths abandoned. Streets that had once thrummed with trade now reeked of waste, littered with refuse and swarming with vermin. Marketplaces offered little, for long-distance trade had collapsed. Exotic goods vanished, even common staples grew scarce. Money lost its meaning as coins were debased, and barter became the desperate language of survival. A pair of sandals might be traded for a sack of grain, a woolen cloak for a pot of salt. Families lived crammed into tenements that sagged dangerously, their stairways creaking, their walls damp with mold. When fires broke out, and they often did, flames consumed whole districts, leaving thousands homeless in a single night. The city, once the beating heart of Rome's power, had become a carcass picked clean by time, neglect, and desperation. Violence pressed in from every side. Raiders swept through the provinces like storms, torching villages, slaughtering men and carrying women and children into captivity. Refugees crowded the roads, clutching their few belongings, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow. Some died of hunger along the way, others fell victim to bandits who preyed on the weak. Even when there was no raid, the fear of one shaped every decision. Families learned to hide grain in buried jars, to scatter at the first sound of hooves, to trust no stranger. Safety was fleeting and peace was an illusion. To live under constant threat of violence was to never truly rest. Even in sleep, fear lingered, ready to jolt the heart awake at the smallest sound. The Roman army, which had once been the bulwark of civilization, now deepened the misery. Mercenaries replaced disciplined legions, and their loyalty extended only as far as their pay. When wages went unpaid, soldiers pillaged the very people they were meant to defend. They seized food from starving farmers, demanded shelter from families who had none to spare, and conscripted young men by force. Villages often saw little difference between raiders and soldiers, for both brought ruin. To lose a son to conscription was as devastating as losing him to violence, for either way he was unlikely to return. Those who did return came back scarred, their bodies broken, their spirits hollowed. Rome's armies no longer protected its people. They preyed upon them, leaving behind resentment and despair. Women bore the silent weight of these years with extraordinary resilience. Widows became common, their husbands claimed by war, plague, or famine. They tilled fields, cared for children, and managed households in the face of overwhelming odds. They gathered herbs to heal the sick, stitched clothing from rags, and found ways to feed their families from the thinnest scraps. Yet they also faced terrible vulnerability. Raids often targeted women, dragging them away into slavery or worse. The constant threat of violence loomed over them, yet they endured, carrying communities on their shoulders. Their stories were rarely written, their names forgotten by history, yet their quiet strength was the foundation on which survival rested. Religion provided both solace and conflict. For many, the church became the center of life, filling the void left by collapsing Roman authority. Bishops became leaders, providing food to the hungry, shelter to the homeless, and guidance to the desperate. Churches became sanctuaries where people huddled during raids, clutching each other as hymns rose above the sounds of fire and steel. Faith transformed suffering into meaning, framing famine and plague as trials that promised eternal reward. Yet religion also sowed division. Disputes over doctrine fractured communities, and pagan practices were stamped out with zeal. Temples that had stood for centuries were toppled, their gods silenced. Some mourned not only the loss of loved ones but the loss of their traditions, their sense of belonging. Faith gave strength to endure, but it also tore apart the fabric of shared identity, leaving scars both spiritual and worldly. Disease stalked the empire with merciless regularity. Plagues swept through towns and villages, spreading swiftly in cramped quarters and along filthy roads. Fever carried away children in days, left mothers coughing blood, and struck down fathers in the midst of labor. Corpses lay unburied, for the living had neither the strength nor the numbers to bury them all. The stench of rot became a part of life, mingling with the smoke of cooking fires and the filth of the streets. Fear of contagion drove families to abandon their sick, leaving them to die alone. Survival often came at the cost of guilt, for to live sometimes meant refusing to care for those one loved. Disease left not only bodies broken but spirits crushed, hollowing out entire communities until silence replaced voices. The collapse of education darkened the world further. Schools that had once taught Latin, philosophy, and mathematics stood abandoned, their teachers gone. Libraries, once filled with the wisdom of centuries, crumbled, their scrolls lost to fire, decay, or neglect. In remote monasteries, monks bent over manuscripts, preserving fragments of Rome's brilliance, but for the vast majority, literacy vanished. Children grew up without letters, learning instead the skills of survival, how to tend fields, repair huts, and flee from danger. The great voices of Rome, its poets, its orators, its historians, fell silent for ordinary people, replaced by hunger, prayer, and toil. Culture, once Rome's pride, narrowed into the bare essentials of endurance. The gulf between rich and poor became a chasm. The wealthy withdrew into fortified estates, their tables still rich with food while peasants starved beyond their gates. Yet even their walls could not hold forever. Raiders targeted villas with savage determination, storming defenses, looting treasures, and carrying away the families who thought themselves secure. Privilege provided only a temporary shield. The poor, meanwhile, bore the brunt of suffering. They scavenged for scraps, begged at city gates, and sold what little they had to survive another day. When their anger boiled over, rebellions flared, but these were swiftly crushed by soldiers or mercenaries. Inequality defined the age, yet in the end, famine, plague, and war leveled all. Hunger did not distinguish between noble and peasant, nor did fire or sword. And still life endured. Families rebuilt homes again and again, refusing to let despair erase them. Farmers planted seeds in blackened soil, their work acts of stubborn defiance against fate. Villages gathered for festivals, sharing songs, dances, and stories that carried echoes of brighter days. Children still laughed, chasing one another in the streets, their joy a fragile flame against the darkness. Mothers lit candles in churches, their trembling flames symbols of endurance. These small acts of persistence were Rome's true legacy, not the grandeur of its monuments or the glory of its legions, but the unyielding will of ordinary people to carry on, no matter how brutal the world became. By the time the empire's last emperor fell, Rome's collapse had already been carved into the lives of its people. The empire had promised eternity, but eternity proved fragile, shattered by hunger, violence, and decay. Yet from its brutality rose the resilience of men and women who endured, who carried fragments of their world into the dawn of something new. Rome's fall was brutal, but humanity endured, fragile yet unbroken. The final years of the Western Empire carried the marks of exhaustion, not only in its institutions but in the very bones of its people. To live during this time was to endure the heavy weight of decline pressing down upon every aspect of existence. The air seemed saturated with loss, as though the empire itself had grown weary of holding together. For those who survived, the brutality of Rome's fall was not a story told in chronicles or carved into monuments. It was lived, day after day, in aching hunger, in shattered families, and in the silence left behind by a world that once seemed eternal. The countryside bore witness to the deepest scars. Families who had once tilled fertile soil with confidence now faced barren fields that yielded almost nothing. The land had been overworked for centuries, and without the empire's machinery of trade and supply, communities were forced to rely on what little their own ground could produce. But even the earth seemed to rebel, producing crops that withered too quickly or failed to sprout at all. Farmers bent their backs beneath a punishing sun, dragging wooden plows through fields, their bodies straining with the work that animals once helped to bear. When harvest time came, sacks that should have been filled with wheat and barley lay pitifully light. For some, there was no harvest at all. Families dug into storehouses only to find empty bins and gnawed grain, the work of vermin. Hunger stalked every home, making itself as familiar as breath. In the villages, the sense of community that had once brought people together was fraying. Where neighbors had once shared food and labor, the scarcity of resources bred suspicion and resentment. Mothers watched one another closely, counting how much bread another child carried in his hands, wondering if her own child would have enough tomorrow. Fires still burned in hearths, but laughter had vanished from the night air. Instead, the silence was broken only by the muffled cries of hungry children and the distant howls of wolves that crept closer each season, emboldened by the emptiness of the land. Cities, once the glittering jewels of Roman civilization, had rotted into carcasses of stone and ash. Streets that had echoed with the noise of traders, chariots, and festivals now lay eerily quiet, broken only by the shuffle of beggars. Aqueducts no longer carried fresh water. Fountains were dry, their marble cracked, their once proud statues toppled. Public baths, symbols of Rome's grandeur, stood abandoned, their pools empty, their walls covered in grime. Marketplaces that had once dazzled with silks, spices, and goods from across the empire now displayed little more than wilted vegetables or coarse loaves baked from flour mixed with sawdust. Coins, debased and nearly worthless, passed reluctantly from hand to hand, but more often barter ruled. A cloak for a sack of beans, a chicken for a cracked jug. The grandeur of the city had become a theater of despair, every broken wall a reminder of what was lost. Violence was no longer an exception, it was the rhythm of existence. Raiders from beyond Rome's borders poured across the land like waves, leaving ruin in their wake. Villages were torched, fields trampled, and families shattered. The cruelty of war showed itself in its most intimate form. Fathers cut down defending their homes, mothers dragged away into slavery, children left to fend for themselves among the ashes. Refugees clogged the roads, their faces gaunt, their feet bleeding, their arms carrying whatever scraps of life they could salvage. They sought shelter in cities already overwhelmed by the hungry and desperate. Few found mercy, many found only closed gates. The road became a graveyard of the displaced, dotted with shallow graves or bodies left unburied by those too weak to dig. The army, once Rome's shield, had become a double-edged sword against its own people. No longer disciplined legions loyal to an empire, they were bands of mercenaries, men loyal only to gold. But gold was scarce, and when wages failed, the soldiers turned their weapons inward. Villages and towns often feared their own defenders as much as they feared invaders. Soldiers broke into homes, seizing what food remained, tearing down doors for firewood, taking sons by force for conscription. Families learned to hide at the sight of approaching banners, not knowing whether those men would protect them or destroy them. The empire's guardians had become its wolves, feeding on the flock they once defended. For women, these years were a crucible of suffering and strength. With men lost to war, famine, or plague, they carried the weight of survival alone. They tilled fields, sewed clothes from rags, tended to the sick, and comforted children who cried in the night from hunger or fear. They bore the grief of widows, the terror of raids, and the indignities of being treated as spoils of war. Yet they endured. Their resilience, often unrecorded by chroniclers, was the quiet force that held together what little remained of community and family. Their lullabies soothed restless children, their prayers filled crumbling churches, their hands coaxed life from barren soil. In their endurance lay the fragile thread of continuity that carried humanity through Rome's collapse. Religion became the cornerstone for many, a shelter amid the storm. The church, more than any other institution, offered meaning when the empire no longer could. Bishops and priests became the voices of authority, guiding people not with armies but with promises of salvation. Churches became sanctuaries during raids, their stone walls filled with the desperate seeking refuge. Inside, flickering candles illuminated faces gaunt with hunger but alight with hope. Hymns rose to the rafters, mingling with the sobs of the fearful. Faith gave shape to suffering, framing famine and war as trials of the soul, offering the promise of eternal reward beyond the misery of the present. But religion also deepened divides, tearing away the last remnants of pagan traditions, silencing the old gods whose temples crumbled into dust. Some clung to them still, whispering prayers to Jupiter, Mars, or Vesta, even as Christian bells rang over ruined towns. The fall of Rome was as much spiritual as it was physical. Disease struck with merciless consistency, thinning populations already weakened by hunger. Plague carried away entire families in a matter of days. Streets filled with the stench of death as corpses lay unburied, survivors too weak or too fearful to carry them away. Fear of contagion broke bonds of kinship. Fathers abandoned sons, brothers abandoned sisters, leaving the sick to die alone. Villages once filled with voices fell silent, their huts empty, their fields overtaken by weeds. Those who lived through such pestilence carried scars deeper than the body, scars of grief, of guilt, of memories that haunted them in every shadow. Knowledge, once the pride of Rome, shrank into the hands of a few. Schools were shuttered, libraries burned or neglected, scrolls lost to time. Children grew up unable to read the words of Cicero, Virgil, or Livy, knowing instead only the immediate lessons of survival. Yet in distant monasteries, monks hunched over parchment by candlelight, preserving fragments of wisdom with painstaking devotion. Their quills scratched into silence as winds howled outside stone walls, keeping alive what little could be saved. For the common people, learning was a luxury beyond reach. For the few, it became a mission to guard the embers of knowledge through the long night of collapse. Inequality remained stark even in decline. The wealthy fortified their estates, surrounding themselves with guards and high walls, stockpiling food while peasants starved outside their gates. Yet their privilege could not shield them forever. Raiders saw their villas as prizes, storming gates, looting treasures and enslaving those within. No marble statue or gilded hall could protect against the fury of collapse. The poor bore the heaviest weight, scavenging for scraps, begging for mercy, selling themselves into bondage to survive another day. Despair and resentment brewed in their hearts, occasionally spilling over into revolt, but such uprisings were met with swift, brutal suppression. Inequality defined the age, but collapse was the great equalizer, for in the end, famine and fire claimed both noble and peasant alike. And yet, amid the ashes, humanity persisted. Families rebuilt huts again and again after raids, their hands shaping mud and timber into homes even as smoke still hung in the air. Farmers planted seeds in ruined soil, each furrow an act of defiance against despair. Villagers gathered for festivals, lighting fires, singing songs and dancing despite their rags, clinging to joy as fiercely as they clung to life. Children still laughed, chasing one another across ruined streets, their games a fragile spark of light in a darkened world. Mothers lit candles in crumbling churches, their flames trembling but unyielding, symbols of hope that refused to die. These small acts of survival were the true monuments of Rome's twilight, carried not in marble but in the stubborn endurance of ordinary lives. The empire had promised eternity, but eternity proved fragile. By the time its last emperor was cast aside, Rome had long since fallen in the hearts and homes of its people. What endured was not the empire's glory, but the resilience of those who bore its collapse. Their lives were brutal, their burdens immense, yet they carried fragments of the old world into the dawn of the new. Rome's fall was not only a story of ruin, but of endurance, a testament to the strength of humanity even in its darkest hour. As the curtain closed on the Western Roman Empire, the experience of daily life shifted from one of gradual decline to a reality entirely transformed. What remained was not a recognizable empire but a scattering of fragments, each community struggling for survival. To live in this time was to inhabit a landscape haunted by memory, ruins of once great cities, broken roads that no longer led anywhere, temples crumbling into dust, and a countryside where ghosts of empire seemed to linger in every shattered stone. People spoke less of Rome as a living presence and more as a tale, already slipping into legend, even as its ruins loomed above them. The brutality of this new age was not only in the violence and hunger but also in the loneliness of knowing that an entire world had passed away. The generations born after the empire's collapse were marked by absence. Children grew up walking among ruins whose purpose they no longer fully understood. Vast amphitheaters, once filled with the roar of crowds, stood hollow and echoing, their arches filled with birds instead of spectators. Broken statues lay half-buried in grass, their features eroded by wind and rain, their meaning fading with each passing season. Roads that had once carried the lifeblood of trade and armies cracked and overgrew with weeds, their stones scavenged by peasants to build crude huts. The infrastructure of empire, so carefully constructed over centuries, was dismantled stone by stone, often by those who no longer remembered who had built it or why. For the ordinary people, the fall of Rome was not a single cataclysmic moment but a slow erosion of everything familiar, leaving them to inhabit the skeleton of a vanished giant. Food, the most basic need of life, remained the constant torment of these years. Without Rome's trade networks, regions that once depended on imports found themselves starving. Grain from Africa no longer filled granaries in Italy. Olive oil, once shipped in vast amphorae, disappeared from common tables. People turned to coarse bread made from whatever grains or wild plants could be gathered, often mixed with ground acorns or weeds to stretch it further. Meat was rare, reserved for the wealthy or stolen in raids. Families gathered roots, berries and whatever they could trap in forests. Hunger carved itself into every face, a universal mark that spared no class for long. Malnutrition weakened bodies, leaving them prey to disease, and generations grew up shorter, thinner, and more fragile than their ancestors. Life expectancy, already precarious, shrank even further. For many, survival meant never truly feeling full. Violence did not cease with the fall of centralized authority, rather, it intensified. With no imperial armies to police the roads, banditry became rampant. Armed gangs roamed the countryside, taking what they wished. Villages fortified themselves as best they could, building wooden palisades or retreating into hills, but no defenses could hold forever. Fear became the atmosphere of daily existence, every distant shout or torch on the horizon a potential threat. Families learned to live with the constant awareness that everything they had, a home, a harvest, even their children, could be stolen in a single night. People carried scars not only on their bodies but in their minds, haunted by the memory of raids that had left them bereft. Yet perhaps the most crushing burden was the loss of order itself. The empire, for all its faults, had been a framework within which life could be understood. Taxes paid, laws enforced, armies stationed, officials appointed. With its fall, that structure disintegrated. Local warlords and chieftains rose in its place, carving territories with swords, ruling through fear rather than justice. Peasants owed allegiance not to a distant emperor but to whoever held power closest to them, whether a barbarian king, a Christian bishop, or a local noble with a band of armed retainers. Loyalty was no longer a matter of patriotism but of sheer survival. People bent their necks to new masters because resistance meant annihilation. In this new world, justice became arbitrary, wealth and power the only real laws. Faith, however, grew even stronger amid this chaos. The Church stepped into the vacuum left by empire, offering not only spiritual guidance but practical leadership. Bishops became judges, negotiators, and protectors. Monasteries emerged as places of refuge, their walls sheltering not only monks but also peasants fleeing from raids. Within those stone sanctuaries, the rhythm of prayer and labor created a fragile stability. The ringing of bells structured the day when all else seemed uncertain, and the promise of heaven gave meaning to suffering that otherwise seemed senseless. For many, the Church was the last unbroken pillar standing amid the ruins of the Roman world. Yet even here, the brutality of survival intruded. Monasteries themselves became targets for raiders, and monks sometimes died defending their manuscripts and altars, their spilled blood staining the very stones they sought to consecrate. Women continued to shoulder immense burdens. In a world of near-constant absence, men lost to war, death, or conscription, it was women who maintained the fragile threads of continuity. They passed down traditions, wove cloth, raised children, and taught them the scraps of wisdom that remained. They endured famine with grim determination, sharing the last crumbs with their children while going hungry themselves. They endured the violence of raids, often at horrific personal cost, yet found ways to rebuild what was destroyed. Their strength was rarely recorded in chronicles, but without them, the survival of families, villages, and even entire regions would have been impossible. Their resilience was the quiet foundation of a collapsing world. Disease and famine wove together into cycles that ravaged the population. Malnourished bodies fell easily to fevers, plagues, and infections. Villages were abandoned after outbreaks, left to rot in silence, their fields reclaiming themselves as wildlands. Survivors carried stories of entire communities wiped away in a matter of weeks, leaving only empty huts and untended graves. Parents buried children, and children sometimes buried parents before wandering away orphaned and alone. The psychological toll of these years was immense. A sense of doom clung to the people who saw death in every shadow and despaired of the future. The brutality of life was not only in physical suffering but in the crushing of hope. Knowledge dwindled further, slipping through the cracks of survival. Few had time or energy for education when each day was consumed by the fight for food and safety. The words of Rome's philosophers and poets faded into silence, their scrolls rotting in forgotten corners or destroyed for kindling. Latin itself began to fragment, evolving into the regional tongues that would one day become French, Spanish, and Italian. Communication across vast territories, once unified by language and law, now fractured into local dialects. What Rome had bound together with roads and legions was coming apart into countless small worlds, each with its own rules, its own struggles, its own fragile existence. Even so, threads of continuity remained. In some places, local leaders tried to revive elements of Roman order, repairing roads, minting coins, or enforcing laws. These efforts often failed, but they reveal how deeply ingrained the memory of Rome remained. People still measured time in relation to the empire, still spoke of its emperors with reverence or scorn, still longed for its return even as its ruins decayed around them. Rome had died, but the idea of Rome lingered, haunting the imagination of its people like a ghost that refused to fade. By the end of the 5th century, the Western Empire was gone, but its fall had left scars that would shape Europe for centuries. The brutality of those years was not forgotten. It lived on in songs and stories, in the cautionary tales parents told their children, in the ruins that dotted the landscape as constant reminders of what had been lost. Yet amid the darkness, seeds of a new world had already been planted. Monasteries would grow into centers of learning, small kingdoms would evolve into nations, and the shattered remains of Roman culture would eventually fuse with the traditions of the so-called barbarians. The fall had been brutal, but it was not the end. It was the breaking of one world and the slow, painful birth of another. And so the story closes, not with the triumphant ending of a glorious civilization, but with the stubborn persistence of life itself. Brutality defined the age, but survival defined its people. They carried on, scarred yet enduring, walking through the ruins into a future they could not imagine. The empire was gone, but humanity remained, carrying within it the memory of Rome, its greatness, its failures, and the lessons of its fall. The aftermath of Rome's collapse was not a sudden silence but a slow fading echo, a world staggering into the unknown. For those who lived in the 6th century and beyond, the Roman Empire was no longer a living power but a memory, still present in ruins, in stories, in the laws that lingered, but no longer able to shape the destiny of its people. Life after Rome was a patchwork of fragments, a brutal reality stitched together by necessity. In the shadow of fallen aqueducts and empty forums, new rhythms of existence took shape, shaped not by emperors or senates but by hunger, fear, and the raw instinct to endure. Daily survival remained the central struggle. Farming was no longer a well-organized part of a vast economic system but a desperate effort to wrest sustenance from the soil. Land once carefully managed by villa estates or taxed by imperial bureaucrats was now tilled in small, uncertain plots by peasants who worked with primitive tools. With trade networks broken, each family had to rely on its own harvest, and the margin between life and death shrank to the thin line of a single poor season. Crop failure meant starvation. The empire had once built vast granaries and transported food across the Mediterranean. Now families huddled in huts, storing meager grains in clay jars, praying that rats or raiders would not take them before winter's end. The brutality of these years was not just in scarcity but in the fragility of every possession. A family might labor all year for a small harvest, only to see it taken by armed men in a single raid. With no empire to enforce laws or punish bandits, theft was rampant. Bands of warriors, often remnants of once ordered armies, roamed the countryside taking livestock, grain, and even children. Villages tried to protect themselves with wooden palisades, but these crude defenses offered little against determined attackers. People learned to hide their food in secret pits, to flee into forests at the first sight of approaching riders, to live always with one eye on the horizon. Fear was constant and trust was scarce. Cities, once the heart of Roman life, dwindled to shadows of themselves. Some were abandoned entirely, their walls crumbling, their theaters and baths left to the weeds. Others survived but shrank drastically, becoming fortified refuges rather than centers of culture. Populations retreated inside walls, abandoning suburbs and open spaces. Streets that had once bustled with merchants and scholars became narrow lanes crowded with refugees. Sophistication gave way to survival. Grand marble buildings were torn down, their stones repurposed for huts, barns, or fortifications. What had once been symbols of glory became quarries for the desperate. The very bones of Rome were cannibalized to keep its survivors alive. For the common people, brutality was a condition of life, not an interruption. Children grew up without the luxuries of schools or libraries, knowing only the lessons of survival. They learned to identify edible plants, to mend clothes from rags, to gather firewood in forests still haunted by wolves. Their games were imitations of warriors, their toys simple sticks or pebbles. Many never lived long enough to reach adulthood, cut down by hunger or sickness. Those who did carried into adulthood a hardened resilience, but also the scars of endless struggle. Innocence was a luxury few could afford. The church became the only institution to stretch across the broken pieces of the former empire, yet even here life was marked by tension. Priests preached salvation, but their congregations came with hunger gnawing at their stomachs and despair in their hearts. Churches became shelters as much as sanctuaries, places where people gathered not only to pray but to escape raids. Bishops and abbots wielded authority not only over souls but over land, becoming new lords in the absence of imperial governors. Monasteries rose as beacons of order, where monks labored to preserve books, cultivate fields and provide charity to the poor. Yet monasteries were also targets, their wealth and stores tempting to raiders. Many monks died defending sacred relics, their lives given in the same brutal tide that swept away peasants and soldiers alike. Disease never loosened its grip. Malaria still stalked the marshes, plagues periodically swept through villages, and small infections often turned fatal in weakened bodies. With no imperial infrastructure to manage clean water or sewage, sanitation collapsed. Rivers that once carried clear water became polluted, spreading sickness. People turned to charms, prayers, and folk remedies, desperate for cures. Death was so common that it no longer shocked. It was a familiar companion, always waiting just beyond the threshold of daily life. Cemeteries grew and graves filled the landscape, each mound a silent marker of Rome's absence. Women, as in the earlier years of collapse, bore immense burdens. They became the anchors of families, holding together what fragments could be salvaged. Their days were filled with endless labor, tending fields, grinding grain, weaving, nursing the sick, protecting children. They often faced violence directly, whether from raiders or from the chaos of a lawless world. Yet they also became the transmitters of memory, telling children stories of Rome's past glories, passing down songs, prayers, and fragments of culture that might otherwise have vanished. In their hands, the fragile threads of continuity were preserved, even as the wider world fell into darkness. The brutality of inequality persisted, though even the wealthy were not immune to collapse. Local lords hoarded food, demanded labor, and tightened their grip over peasants who became bound to the land in exchange for protection. The seeds of medieval serfdom were planted in this era of desperation. Freedom became a distant dream, replaced by the harsh reality of dependence on whatever local power could shield one from raids or famine. The poor worked themselves to exhaustion for scraps, while the wealthy built small fortresses, fearful of attack, their privileges tempered by the knowledge that a stronger warlord might strip them of everything overnight. Yet amid all the brutality, there remained sparks of resilience. Festivals continued, though smaller and humbler. People still gathered to celebrate harvests, to sing, to dance, to find joy in fleeting moments. Children still played, laughter echoing against ruins. Families still sat around fires, sharing stories of ancestors, weaving hope into their children's hearts. Monks still copied books by candlelight, their quills scratching out words of wisdom that would outlast centuries of chaos. These small acts of persistence carried humanity forward, even as the world they had inherited seemed shattered beyond repair. By the time the 6th century dawned, the Western Roman Empire was a memory, but its fall still shaped every life. The brutality of the age was the crucible from which a new world was slowly forged. Out of hunger came resilience. Out of violence came the need for protection that would give rise to medieval kingdoms. Out of despair came faith, anchoring people in hope of a better eternity. The fall of Rome had destroyed a civilization, but it had not destroyed humanity's capacity to endure, to adapt, to build again. For those who lived through it, the fall was not a grand historical event but the texture of their daily lives. The gnaw of hunger, the fear of raids, the grief of burying loved ones, the struggle to rebuild again and again. Their world was brutal, but they survived it, carrying within them the seeds of what would eventually become Europe. In their endurance lay the truest legacy of Rome, not marble or armies, but the persistence of ordinary people who refused to let darkness extinguish them. The further the Roman world receded into memory, the more its collapse weighed upon those who struggled to live in the wreckage it left behind. To later generations, the grandeur of the empire became a story told around fires, a tale of emperors, armies, and monuments that seemed almost mythical. But for those who lived in its long shadow, the brutality of Rome's fall was no myth. It was a daily reality etched into their very flesh and bone. They walked through broken cities, ate from meager harvests, buried loved ones, and carried the ache of survival as naturally as breathing. Their lives were testaments to endurance in a world where nothing came easily, and everything could be lost in a single moment. The land itself bore the mark of collapse. Fields that had once been carefully irrigated by aqueducts lay parched, the stone channels broken and clogged with weeds. Vineyards and olive groves, once tended with skill, grew wild or withered from neglect. Farmers lacked the resources or knowledge to maintain the complex systems Rome had relied upon for centuries. Harvests shrank and famine struck in cycles that seemed endless. People relied increasingly on what nature offered freely: wild fruits, nuts, mushrooms, and game. Forests were stripped of animals, rivers emptied of fish, until scarcity extended even into the wilderness. The earth, exhausted and overused, seemed to conspire with hunger, offering little to those who desperately scraped at its surface. The brutality of famine was not only in hunger but in the choices it forced. Families sometimes abandoned their weakest members, leaving the sick or elderly behind when food could not stretch far enough. Parents, gaunt with starvation, watched their children waste away, powerless to help. In some villages, whispers told of cannibalism during the worst winters, acts of desperation that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Food was no longer nourishment but the most contested resource, hoarded, hidden, stolen, and fought over. Hunger became the greatest enemy of all, a foe more relentless than invading armies. The collapse of trade deepened the misery. Rome had once connected distant lands through its networks of roads and ports, bringing goods from across the empire. Spices from the east, grain from Africa, wine from Gaul, and textiles from Britain had flowed into markets that dazzled the senses. Now those connections were broken. Each region was cut off, forced to live with only what it could produce locally. Salt, essential for preserving food, grew scarce in inland communities, leading to further malnutrition and disease. Cloth became precious. Many wore rags patched again and again until they fell apart. Shoes were luxuries. Coins, debased and useless, disappeared, replaced by barter. A chicken might be traded for a handful of beans, a cloak for a few hours of labor. The economy that had once supported an empire had shrunk to the smallest exchanges, each one a reminder of how much had been lost. Violence remained ever present. The roads, no longer patrolled by Roman legions, became corridors of danger. Bandits prowled in gangs, preying on travelers and refugees. Armed raiders descended without warning on villages, leaving fire and death behind them. The collapse of centralized authority meant there was no higher power to appeal to, no governor or magistrate to enforce justice. Local leaders ruled with the sword, their authority resting solely on force. Peasants bent their necks in submission to whichever warlord dominated their region, knowing that defiance would mean annihilation. For ordinary people, power had become a matter of survival, not principle. Loyalty was demanded, not earned, and betrayal was punished swiftly and mercilessly. The brutality of lawlessness eroded trust between neighbors. Communities fractured as people competed for scarce resources, each family desperate to protect its own. Suspicion replaced solidarity. A missing loaf of bread could spark accusations and violence. Villages divided into factions, some aligning with one lord, others with another, while others fled entirely to live in hiding. Social bonds that had once been woven tightly by Roman order unraveled, leaving individuals exposed in a world of fear. Faith, however, grew into the one refuge where order and meaning could still be found. Christianity spread across the ruins, offering hope of eternal life when earthly life was filled with suffering. The church became the central institution, binding people together through ritual, belief, and community. Priests preached of trials that purified the soul, of suffering that mirrored Christ's own, of heaven that awaited beyond death. For many, this gave shape to their pain and allowed them to endure what might otherwise have seemed unbearable. Yet even faith was touched by brutality. Religious divisions sparked violence as heresies were denounced, pagans were persecuted, and rival sects clashed. The spiritual hunger for certainty sometimes fueled conflict as much as it soothed despair. Monasteries emerged as islands of stability. Within their walls, monks cultivated fields with diligence, preserved texts, and offered charity. They embodied a discipline that contrasted with the chaos outside. The sound of bells marking the hours of prayer became a rhythm of order in a disordered world. Yet even monasteries were not spared the violence of the age. Raiders often saw them as easy targets, their wealth in books, food, and sacred objects tempting plunderers. Some monks died with swords in hand, defending their sanctuaries, while others saw their life's work reduced to ashes in a single night. Still, the persistence of these communities ensured that fragments of Roman knowledge and Christian teaching would survive the long centuries of darkness. Women carried the heaviest burdens of all. They worked the fields, raised children, wove cloth, and managed households often without the support of men. They faced the terror of raids with bravery born of necessity, protecting their families as best they could. They endured violence and exploitation, yet they also preserved traditions, teaching children songs, prayers, and stories that connected them to the past. Their strength was rarely recorded, but it was essential. Without their labor and resilience, the fragile continuity of community life would have collapsed entirely. Disease continued its relentless assault. With famine weakening bodies and poor sanitation spreading contagion, villages were periodically swept by waves of plague or fever. Entire families disappeared in days, leaving their huts abandoned. Survivors carried scars not only of illness but of grief. Cemeteries grew, and fields of graves stood as mute testimony to the fragility of life. Death became so familiar that it no longer shocked, but each loss deepened the sense of despair. For many, faith was the only salve, the promise that suffering was not meaningless. Even knowledge, once the pride of Rome, now seemed fragile. Literacy dwindled outside of monasteries, and oral tradition replaced written culture for most people. Children grew up never learning to read, never seeing the scrolls and codices their ancestors had studied. Latin fragmented into local dialects, communication across distances grew harder, and the shared identity of Rome gave way to countless small cultures. Yet in the flickering candlelight of monastic scriptoria, monks bent over parchment, scratching out the words of scripture, philosophy, and history. These quiet acts of preservation ensured that something of Rome would endure, even if the wider world forgot. Despite all this brutality, people endured. They built new lives amid ruins, carving existence out of hardship. They married, bore children, celebrated harvests, and marked the passing of seasons. They found joy in simple things: the warmth of a fire, the laughter of children, the taste of fresh bread after hunger. They clung to hope, even if it was fragile, even if it rested more in the next world than this one. Their persistence was itself a triumph, a defiance of despair. By the close of the 6th century, Rome's fall had become less an event and more a condition of life. People no longer spoke of the empire as something that might return. It was a past age, remembered but irretrievable. The brutality of those centuries had reshaped the world, carving away its grandeur, leaving behind something smaller, harsher, but also more resilient. From the ashes of Rome, new societies would one day grow. For now, the survivors carried on, their lives a mixture of suffering and endurance, each day a testimony to the unyielding human will to live. By the time the memory of Rome was measured not in years but in generations, the people of the former empire lived in a world entirely transformed. The once unified system of roads, cities, and armies had dissolved into a patchwork of isolated communities, each struggling to survive. Yet even in this shattered landscape, the shadow of Rome lingered. Ruins dotted the countryside like ancient skeletons, reminders of a time when order and abundance had seemed eternal. For those who walked among them, the contrast between past glory and present hardship deepened the sense of loss. To live after Rome was to inhabit a world haunted by its absence, where every crumbling aqueduct and broken amphitheater whispered of what had been lost. The brutality of this age was not only physical but psychological. People carried a profound awareness that they lived in the ruins of something greater. The stories of emperors and generals, of legions and victories, of marble cities and golden festivals, were repeated in whispers, half legend and half history. Children listened to these tales as if they belonged to another world, one as distant as the myths of gods and heroes. This sense of decline weighed heavily on communities, pressing down with an invisible force. It was not only the hunger and violence that scarred them, but the knowledge that they were the heirs of a fallen greatness, reduced to scratching survival from the dirt. Agriculture remained the most brutal challenge. With no centralized authority to manage land and resources, farming was an exhausting and uncertain task. Tools were crude, often little more than wooden plows drawn by exhausted oxen or even by humans themselves. Soil, depleted by centuries of use, yielded little. Crop rotations and advanced techniques once known under Roman management were forgotten or abandoned. Famine struck regularly, and when it came, it did not discriminate. Entire villages shrank or disappeared, their inhabitants scattered or starved. Families clung to survival by gathering acorns, nettles, and wild roots, mixing them into coarse, bitter bread. The taste of such food was a reminder of desperation, but it was better than death. The absence of Rome's trade networks further isolated people. A family in Italy could no longer rely on African grain ships or Gallic vineyards. Goods became hyperlocal and scarcity was the rule. Salt was rare, cloth was patched until it could be patched no more, and iron tools were treasures. A broken blade might be reforged again and again until nothing was left but scraps. Even pottery became precious, mended with lead or resin rather than discarded. Every object was a marker of wealth, every tool a lifeline. Life shrank to the scale of villages, where barter replaced currency, and the rhythms of survival revolved around harvests and raids. Violence defined the world as much as hunger. With no imperial garrisons to keep order, power belonged to whoever held the sword. Local warlords, sometimes former Roman officers or barbarian chieftains, ruled small territories, demanding loyalty and tribute from peasants. Their rule was often harsh, built on fear rather than justice. Rebellion was crushed without mercy, and those who refused allegiance were slaughtered or enslaved. For the common people, there was no appeal, no emperor to whom they could cry out. Justice was whatever the strong decided it to be. Life under these petty rulers was a constant gamble. Submission might bring temporary safety, but it could also bring endless exploitation. The roads, once Rome's arteries of life, had become avenues of danger. Bandits prowled in gangs, preying on travelers and refugees. What had been highways of trade and culture now carried only fear. People avoided travel unless absolutely necessary, preferring isolation to the risks of the open road. Communication between regions broke down, and knowledge of distant lands faded. The Mediterranean, once called a Roman lake, no longer tied the world together. Instead, it was a sea of danger, patrolled by pirates and raiders. The vast interconnectedness that had defined Rome was gone, replaced by small, fragile pockets of life, each cut off from the other. Religion grew ever more central in this fragmented world. Christianity, having spread across the ruins, provided not only spiritual hope but also social structure. Churches became gathering places, sanctuaries, and even centers of governance. Bishops wielded authority that extended beyond faith, acting as judges and leaders in communities with no other institutions. The rituals of the church brought stability, bells marking the hours, processions celebrating feasts, prayers anchoring lives that might otherwise feel meaningless. Faith was a shield against despair, a promise that suffering had a purpose. Yet even here, brutality intruded. Disputes over doctrine led to bitter conflicts. and the suppression of pagan traditions left many alienated. Sacred spaces were not immune to violence. Churches were plundered, monasteries burned, and holy men slain. Still, the church endured, carrying within it the fragile light of continuity. Monasteries became islands of resilience amid the storm. Behind their walls, monks copied manuscripts, preserving fragments of Roman knowledge and Christian teaching. They tilled fields with care, experimented with farming, and provided food to the poor when famine struck. Their discipline and order contrasted with the chaos outside, and their prayers gave voice to the hopes of countless people. But monasteries too faced the brutality of the age. Raiders often targeted them for their wealth, and monks sometimes met death with quiet resignation, choosing martyrdom over surrender. Yet the survival of knowledge within these walls would prove crucial, ensuring that not all of Rome was lost to the darkness. For women, life continued to be marked by resilience and suffering. They were the keepers of households, the bearers of children, the protectors of fragile family units. They tilled fields, wove cloth, and nursed the sick, often carrying burdens greater than their bodies could bear. They endured the fear of raids, the trauma of violence, and the grief of losing children to famine or disease. Yet they also nurtured traditions, telling stories of Rome's past, singing songs that carried fragments of culture into the future. Their strength, though largely invisible in written records, was the foundation of survival. Without their labor and endurance, the continuity of life itself would have collapsed. Disease remained a relentless scourge. With poor sanitation, malnutrition, and overcrowded refuges, outbreaks spread rapidly. Plague could decimate a community in weeks, leaving only silence behind. Survivors carried scars, both physical and emotional. Cemeteries filled, and death became an everyday companion. The psychological weight of constant loss was immense. People lived with the expectation that tomorrow might bring sickness, hunger, or violence, and few reached old age. Life expectancy shrank and childhood mortality was staggering. Yet even in the face of such devastation, people persisted, clinging to faith and to one another. Amid this brutality, there remained sparks of continuity. Festivals were still celebrated, though humbler than before. Families still gathered for harvest feasts, sang songs, and told stories by the fire. Children still played in the ruins, turning broken columns into playgrounds. Joy had not been extinguished. It was simply rarer, more fragile, and more deeply cherished. These small acts of resilience carried humanity through the dark years, planting seeds for the societies that would one day emerge. By the 7th century, Rome was no longer remembered as a living reality but as a legend. Yet its shadow stretched across every aspect of life. People still walked on Roman roads, drew water from Roman aqueducts, and sheltered in Roman walls. They lived among its ruins, haunted by its memory, shaped by its absence. The brutality of their existence was the crucible in which the medieval world was being forged. Out of hunger came endurance, out of violence came new forms of order, out of despair came faith. The empire was gone, but its fall continued to define those who survived it, carving scars that would endure for centuries. By the time centuries had passed since the fall of Rome, the world that emerged bore little resemblance to the empire that had once united much of Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond. What endured was not Rome itself but the scars of its collapse, scars etched into the lives of the people who had struggled through its aftermath. Their experience was not one of sudden apocalypse but of grinding attrition, a slow unraveling that forced them to adapt, to endure, and to rebuild in the face of endless hardship. The brutality of life during this period was both a consequence of Rome's absence and a forge that shaped new societies in ways few could have imagined. The physical landscape itself was the most visible testimony to what had been lost. Across Italy, Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa, immense Roman structures stood in ruin. Amphitheaters that had once echoed with cheers fell silent, their stones scavenged for homes and fortifications. Temples, once gleaming with marble, crumbled into rubble, their gods forgotten or replaced. Roads that had tied the empire together broke apart, choked with weeds, their stones pulled up to build walls. Aqueducts collapsed, their lifeblood of water ceasing to flow. The ruins were not merely reminders of decline, they became part of everyday life. Children played among toppled columns, farmers pastured their animals within abandoned forums, and villagers built huts against the broken arches of aqueducts. Rome's bones became the foundation of the New World, even as they testified to a grandeur that seemed impossible to reclaim. For those who lived amid these ruins, survival remained a brutal struggle. Agriculture continued to define existence, but it was fraught with uncertainty. Without Rome's centralized grain distribution, every harvest was a gamble. A bad season meant hunger, 2 bad seasons could mean famine. The soil, depleted from centuries of intensive use, often yielded little. Farmers relied on primitive tools, scratching at the earth with wooden plows and iron tips that dulled quickly. They worked from dawn until dusk, their backs bent, their bodies worn down by endless toil. Yet even such labor offered no guarantees. Storms, droughts, or raiders could undo months of work in an instant. To live from the land was to live with constant fear of loss. The absence of stable governance magnified these fears. Communities were left to fend for themselves, often under the control of local warlords or chieftains. These men demanded tribute and loyalty, their power enforced by armed retainers. For peasants, life under such rulers was a cycle of subservience, exploitation, and fear. Tribute might come in the form of grain, livestock, or labor, leaving families with barely enough to survive. Resistance was unthinkable, for reprisals were swift and merciless. To live under a warlord's rule was to live with the constant reminder that one's life and livelihood were not one's own. Justice had become a weapon wielded by the powerful, and survival depended on submission. The threat of violence extended beyond local rulers. Raiders and invaders continued to sweep across regions, plundering what little people possessed. Viking incursions in the north, Arab raids in the south, and nomadic pressures in the east all contributed to the sense of perpetual danger. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and populations enslaved. The sound of hoofbeats on the horizon often meant death or capture. Entire communities fled into forests, marshes, or hills to escape, abandoning homes and fields to avoid slaughter. For many, life was defined by flight, their possessions carried on their backs, their eyes always scanning the horizon for threats. Hunger and violence were not the only brutal forces at work. Disease continued to ravage communities, spreading quickly through malnourished and overcrowded populations. Outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and fever struck without warning, decimating villages and towns. With no medical knowledge beyond herbal remedies and prayer, people were helpless before such scourges. The stench of death was familiar, cemeteries grew crowded, and grief was a constant companion. Life expectancy was short, and families were often torn apart before their bonds had fully formed. Survival was measured not in decades but in years, sometimes even months. Religion, however, offered both solace and conflict. Christianity, now dominant across former Roman territories, gave meaning to suffering, framing it as part of God's plan and promising eternal reward for endurance. Churches became the centers of life, offering spiritual hope and practical support. Priests baptized, married, and buried, guiding communities through life's milestones. Monasteries continued their quiet work of preservation, copying texts, cultivating fields, and offering hospitality. They were islands of stability amid chaos, though they too were targets of violence. Faith united communities, yet it also divided them. Disputes over doctrine, accusations of heresy, and conflicts between sects sometimes erupted into violence, showing that even spiritual refuge was not free from the brutality of the age. Despite the harshness of existence, people continued to create. Songs were sung, stories told, and traditions passed down. Oral culture flourished in place of written knowledge, shaping identities and preserving memories. Folktales, legends, and myths wove together fragments of Roman memory with local beliefs, creating a new tapestry of culture. These stories were not mere entertainment but survival tools, binding communities together with shared meaning. Children learned through song and story what their ancestors had once known through books. Though much was lost, imagination and memory ensured that people did not live solely in despair. Women carried forward much of this cultural continuity. They preserved songs, prayers, and rituals, passing them to their children. They bore the weight of survival, tending fields, raising families, and holding households together even when men were absent through war, death, or labor. Their endurance was often silent but indispensable. Without their resilience, entire communities might have collapsed. Yet their lives were marked by vulnerability. Raids, famine, and exploitation left them exposed to dangers both physical and emotional. Their strength was forged in suffering, and though rarely recorded, it was the unseen foundation of endurance. Amid this harsh existence, joy still flickered. A successful harvest brought celebration with dancing, feasting, and the sharing of food. Births were marked with hope, marriages with festivity, and even funerals with remembrance that honored the endurance of life. These moments were fragile but powerful, brief respites from suffering that reminded people of what was worth enduring for. Community bonds, though strained, offered support. Neighbors shared what little they had, helped rebuild after raids, and stood together against threats. Solidarity, though often tested, could still be found. By the 8th century, the outlines of a new world were emerging. The brutal centuries following Rome's fall had forced adaptation, carving away illusions of empire and replacing them with smaller, localized forms of power and identity. Kingdoms began to rise from the ruins, shaped by the hardships of the past. The memory of Rome lingered, not as a living reality but as a legend, an example both of greatness and of fragility. The brutality of the fall had taught harsh lessons, that abundance could vanish, that power could collapse, and that survival required resilience above all. For the people who lived through those centuries, however, such lessons were not abstract. They were written into their lives, their hunger, their grief, their labor, and their faith. To live during the fall of Rome was to know a world stripped bare of security, to endure suffering that seemed without end, and yet to continue because there was no other choice. In that endurance lay the seeds of the future. Brutality had not destroyed humanity, it had reshaped it, preparing the way for the societies that would rise from the ruins. The fall of Rome, then, was not only the end of an empire but the beginning of a transformation. It was a crucible in which new identities, cultures, and systems of power were forged. Yet the cost of this transformation was immense. Generations suffered so that others might inherit a world remade. The brutality of their lives was the foundation upon which the medieval world would stand. For those who endured it, the empire's fall was not a story of history but the very air they breathed, the hardship they endured, and the memory they carried forward. The story of Rome's fall is often told in terms of emperors deposed, cities sacked, and armies defeated. Yet the true measure of that collapse was written in the daily lives of countless men, women, and children who endured the empire's final centuries. Their experiences were not grandiose tales of glory or conquest, but of hunger gnawing at bellies, of fear pressing against every breath, and of hope fighting desperately to survive amid ruin. In the end, the fall of Rome was not one event, nor a single moment of destruction, but a long unraveling, a relentless erosion of security, identity, and order. Its brutality was not just in the flames of cities or the clash of swords, but in the slow grinding despair that touched every corner of life. By the last generation of the Western Empire, the grandeur of Rome was already a ghost. Children born in the 5th century grew up not among marble forums and bustling markets, but among ruins and silence. Aqueducts no longer carried water, baths stood empty, and libraries were husks filled with mold and dust. The glory their grandparents remembered seemed like myth, fading further with each passing year. Roads, once alive with traders and travelers, lay broken, overgrown with weeds, haunted by bandits rather than merchants. The empire that had once claimed to bring peace and prosperity to the world had left behind little more than memories and ash. The brutality of these years was most vividly felt in hunger. Famine was no longer a temporary crisis but a recurring presence. Families scraped together meals from whatever could be found. Acorns ground into bitter flour, weeds boiled into thin stews, even bark stripped from trees to quiet empty stomachs. Children cried in hunger until their voices weakened into silence. Parents faced impossible choices, sometimes going without food themselves so that their children might live another day. Starvation became an inheritance passed from one generation to the next, etching itself into the faces of survivors. The Roman promise of bread and circuses was long gone. What remained was the endless search for crumbs. Violence was the other constant companion of Rome's twilight. Armies no longer fought for a unified empire but for warlords, kings, and shifting loyalties. Villages and towns were little more than prizes in an endless struggle, captured one year and burned the next. Raiders descended like storms, carrying away livestock, wealth, and people. Women and children were dragged into slavery, their cries echoing through the night as flames consumed their homes. For those left behind, grief was as brutal as fire. The roads, once safe under Rome's order, became avenues of terror where no traveler knew if he would reach his destination alive. The collapse of security was perhaps the most crushing loss of all, for it left every man and woman with the knowledge that nothing could be trusted, not even tomorrow. Disease spread across this weakened landscape with merciless efficiency. Plagues ravaged villages already thinned by famine and war, striking down the young, the strong, and the frail alike. Bodies piled in streets when there were not enough hands to bury them. Families abandoned the sick out of fear, leaving them to die alone. Survivors carried not only scars but guilt, haunted by those they could not save. The combination of famine, violence, and plague left entire communities hollowed out, ghost villages scattered across the empire's former heartlands. The land itself seemed to mourn, its fields untended, its cities silent, its monuments crumbling. And yet, even in the darkest hours, humanity clung to fragments of hope. Religion offered meaning where the empire offered none. Churches became sanctuaries, their bells calling the desperate to prayer. Bishops stood as leaders, replacing absent governors and generals, guiding their flocks through famine and fear. The promise of eternal life brought comfort to those who saw only suffering in the world around them. Candles flickered in darkened chapels, each flame a fragile symbol of defiance against despair. Faith became not just a spiritual choice but a tool of survival, binding communities together when everything else had fallen apart. Women, often overlooked by chroniclers, were the silent pillars of survival. They raised children in huts that leaked in the rain, tilled fields when men were lost to war, and mended clothes until rags became garments. They preserved fragments of culture in lullabies, stories, and whispered prayers, passing on identity when institutions collapsed. They bore the brunt of violence but also carried the resilience that allowed life to continue. Their endurance, quiet and relentless, was perhaps the truest act of defiance in a collapsing world. In the countryside, peasants rebuilt again and again. After raids, they cleared the ashes, gathered fallen stones, and raised their huts anew. After famine, they planted seeds with trembling hope, praying the soil would be kinder next season. After plague, they buried their dead and clung tighter to the living. Each act of survival was a refusal to let despair have the final word. They were not warriors or rulers, yet they carried the empire's spirit further than any emperor's decree. Their lives were brutal but they endured. The wealthy too learned that privilege could not shield them forever. They fortified estates, hired guards and hoarded supplies, but raiders and war did not discriminate. Villas that had once echoed with laughter and song were reduced to ruins, their treasures scattered, their families enslaved or slaughtered. The illusion of safety behind stone walls crumbled as swiftly as Rome's borders. In the end, wealth could delay suffering but not escape it. What emerged from this long age of brutality was not a sudden dawn of peace, but a slow transformation. Out of Rome's collapse rose new kingdoms, new cultures and new identities. The Gothic, the Frankish, the Anglo-Saxon, and others carved their own worlds out of the ruins. Latin gave way to early forms of the languages that would one day dominate Europe. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, became the unifying thread of a fractured continent. Knowledge, though diminished, was preserved in monasteries, seeds waiting to sprout in centuries to come. Rome itself had fallen, but humanity, scarred and reshaped, had survived. To say life was brutal during the fall of Rome is to only hint at the reality. It was a time when every day was uncertain, when hunger gnawed, when violence struck without warning, when hope flickered but never died. It was a time when families rebuilt from ashes, when children laughed even in ruins, when candles burned in darkened churches. It was a time when humanity endured its own breaking and somehow emerged, changed but unextinguished. The empire promised eternity, yet eternity proved fragile. Marble crumbled, legions vanished, emperors fell. What endured were not the monuments of power but the resilience of ordinary people. Their suffering was immense, their burdens heavy, yet their survival carried the world forward. From their endurance came the seeds of new civilizations, the echoes of Rome living on in altered forms. The fall of Rome was brutal beyond measure, but it was not the end of humanity. It was a passage, a long, painful twilight that gave way at last to a new dawn. In the ashes of empire, life endured, fragile yet unyielding, proving that even in the face of overwhelming ruin, the human spirit cannot be extinguished. That is why the story of Rome's fall still echoes, not only because of its grandeur lost, but because of the unbreakable endurance of those who survived it.